Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. In early 2018, I was working for a major market research firm in Chicago. I'd been with the company for 6 years and felt accomplished, with a promising career trajectory ahead of me. Then, on a Tuesday morning, everything took an unexpected turn. After waking up around 6:30, I completed my morning routine and headed down to my building's parking garage. There were about 15 or 20 cars parked, and as I approached mine, I noticed a solitary figure leaning against the wall near the hood. It was a young man, apparently in his mid-20s, wearing a baseball cap and a hoodie with the hood up. He just stared at me fixedly as I walked. I maintained eye contact, but was careful not to appear hostile. When I reached my car, I thought it better to understand the situation before unlocking the door. "Can I help you with something?" I asked in a neutral, direct tone. Without hesitation, he replied, "Nobody can help you now, brother." At the time, I thought he was just trying to be funny. I decided to ignore him, got into my car, and began backing out. But throughout this time, the guy remained there, staring at me and smiling as if his phrase had been incredibly clever. The drive to work didn't improve my mood. I was cut off or insulted by drivers about 15 times in 30 minutes. After a long and tedious Tuesday meeting, the garage incident had faded from my mind. The day was busy and I moved on. It was only in the late afternoon that I remembered the encounter. I thought perhaps the guy was there to steal or vandalize a car, maybe break a window and grab something valuable. I imagined someone in my building would have a terrible day, but little did I know that the unlucky one would be me. At the end of the workday, I returned home. In the parking garage, there were no signs of break-ins or broken windows. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking everything had ended well. However, when I reached my floor and turned down the hallway leading to my apartment, I encountered something horrific, and the smell hit me before the sight. Someone had defecated on my door, and it wasn't just any kind of feces. It was diarrhea, splattered in sprays across the entire area, as if it had been done with incredible force. I stood there for several seconds, trying to process what I was seeing. My first thought was, no, this can't be happening. But when the odor hit my nostrils, I had to cover my face to avoid vomiting. I immediately returned to the lobby and contacted an emergency cleaning service. I also notified the building management to request security camera footage. I knew all corridors and main entrances were monitored by cameras. In fact, it was one of the reasons I chose to live there. Fortunately, obtaining the recordings was quick and straightforward. Once the cleaners arrived, and I compensated them well for the urgent work, I was able to enter my apartment around 9:45 at night. I made coffee, sat down with my laptop, and began reviewing the videos that management had made available to me through a secure file transfer. It took some time to locate the right segment in the footage. At some point in the early afternoon, a man wearing a hoodie entered through the main entrance of the building. Like the guy I saw in the garage, he wore a hood and cap, but there was a difference. This one wore a reflective vest and carried a package, making him look like a delivery person. I assumed he would leave the package at some apartment and exit soon after. That wasn't the case. He went directly to my door, placed the package on the floor, lowered his pants, and made the entire mess right there, without even cleaning himself afterward. He pulled his pants up and left the building with complete casualness, as if it were a routine task. I was incredulous. Everything was recorded clearly. The strangest thing to me was that he didn't seem to be the same man I saw in the morning in the garage. I was 90% certain of that. This subject was taller and stronger, but something told me the two were connected somehow, even if I didn't understand why they were targeting me. I called the police, but as I imagined, they were of little help. They suggested I check if it wasn't a prank by someone I knew. After I politely explained that my friends didn't have the habit of defecating on doors, they said they would be in touch if there were any updates. They even laughed about the situation. The next day, I was the one who called them again. I woke up around 6:30, followed my routine, and went down to the garage to find my car practically destroyed. I notified my boss about what was happening, and he, being understanding, gave me the day off to deal with the police and find alternative transportation. When calling the police once more, I spoke with another department, reporting the car vandalism. Their attitude was just as useless as before. They said they would analyze the camera footage, but warned that, with covered faces, it would be difficult to identify the culprits. Nevertheless, I sent the recordings to the email they provided. Later that day, I began to think about how exposed I was at home. It was imprudent to stay there, since I seemed to be the target of something bigger. After my car was taken for repairs, I decided to seek refuge. I found a 3-star hotel with available rooms, ordered a rideshare, and made the reservation. I called my father for advice. He agreed it was alarming that these people knew exactly where I lived. One thing was someone attacking my car after seeing me driving, but quite another was knowing the exact door of my apartment. Moreover, the actions were clearly escalating. It was logical to imagine that the next step would be a more direct attack, which eventually happened. I had no idea who these people were. In fact, I still don't know. And that made everything even more frightening and confusing. How could something so serious have started with a strange look and a few exchanged words? Who were they? A gang? Relatives? Friends of someone I'd crossed paths with? How far did they intend to go? Far enough, it seemed, to break into my apartment and completely destroy it. Remember when I mentioned that I reserved the hotel while deciding whether to stay there for a week or more? Well, the next day, I planned to stop by my apartment to take care of some pending matters and grab some personal items before returning to the hotel after work. I took a taxi, went up to my floor, and encountered a staggering scene. The apartment door was hanging only by its hinges. One of my neighbors was standing there with a look that mixed shock and fear. When I entered, I understood why. The place had been devastated. The glass shower door was in pieces. The bed frame was completely destroyed. Both the living room and kitchen were covered in shards of glass and porcelain, the result of a kind of massacre of the contents of the cabinets. Torn paintings, my TV and laptop smashed. But the hardest blow was the aquarium. They had broken it, killing all my fish. I was devastated. Breaking material things was something I could bear. But taking the lives of my fish, such defenseless and peaceful beings in their small aquatic universe, I felt I needed all the strength I had not to collapse right there in front of my neighbor. About an hour later, I was back at the hotel and had to face two harsh truths. First, I would have to call the police for the third time in 3 days. Second, I had no choice but to find a new place to live. Still, what consumed me most was the search for a reason. Nothing made sense anymore. A lunatic breaking my car and defecating on my door, because of a small confrontation, could perhaps be explained by some sick logic, especially if it was someone under the influence of drugs. But this level of destruction was completely surreal. I wondered if I had been home that night, would they have killed me? How had such a trivial situation transformed into this in just 3 days? It was like an endless nightmare, but in reality, things were still far from over. When I accessed the building's security footage again, and it was clear that management was tired of the problems I was attracting, what I saw was even more disturbing. It wasn't a disorganized group of hooded individuals like those who destroyed my car. This time, the intruders wore black with full masks and gloves. They looked professional. It was terrifying. It was then that I decided I would never sleep in that apartment again, and began looking for a new place to live. However, a few days later, there was another escalation, and I realized that changing addresses wouldn't solve the problem. I started taking the L train to and from work, which required walking several blocks to the office. It didn't bother me much. I enjoyed grabbing something to eat after work, and I found the train more peaceful than being stuck in traffic. This change in routine even brought some peace of mind, since I avoided any place where they could locate me. In the end, it turned out to be a pleasant change. As I was walking down Michigan Avenue, turning onto West Madison Street with my plate of brisket and fries from a food truck, I heard someone calling my name. It was an animated, almost cheerful shout, and that's precisely what made me turn to look. If it had been an irritated tone or something strange, I probably would have ignored it and quickened my pace, trying to disappear among the people. But it seemed friendly. I turned, expecting to find an old colleague or friend. Instead, I encountered a complete stranger. He came running toward me, and suddenly, bam! A direct punch to the middle of my face. I fell backward, and my food spilled all over me. The guy ran away, shouting my name and something like, "You're garbage, man." You're garbage, well, that was Chicago. Of the 24 people who witnessed the scene, only about 3 approached to ask, "Are you okay?" Well, I clearly wasn't. At that point, several days had passed without incidents, but my life was in chaos, destroyed car, need to find a new apartment, and all the mystery behind these attacks. For a moment, I thought things were calming down, but that punch made me realize that whoever it was had been following me, even in my daily routes. I wasn't safe anywhere, not even at the hotel. It might seem like an exaggeration, but I felt like running to my parents' house. The problem was that bringing these criminals to them could put them in danger too. I couldn't even tell them how serious the situation was, because I knew they would insist on taking some action that would only complicate things further. My only support network, besides the police, who only then began to take me seriously, was my boss, who showed admirable understanding and granted me paid leave for an indefinite period until the situation was resolved. Between contacts with police officers, potential landlords, and building managers, my phone wouldn't stop ringing, always receiving calls from unknown or unidentified numbers. A few days later, while I was in another hotel room, my cell phone started vibrating on the table with the message, "Private number," on the screen. Without hesitation, I answered. An articulate, deep, and confident voice began to speak. When the man used my name, I thought it might be a police officer or someone responding to one of the rental applications I had filled out. But as the conversation continued, I realized it was something different. He mentioned my personal information, my full name, old address, even details of my professional history, clearly confirming that he knew a lot about me. I answered only one or two questions before politely asking the reason for the call. That's when he identified himself as Marcus, clarifying that it wasn't his real name. He said he worked for a technology company on the West Coast and stated that he had found some of my personal information circulating on the internet. At first, I was confused. I thought Marcus was talking about my social media or about my email and phone number listed on the company website. But it wasn't that at all. He explained that my name, my old address, my photos, and even my professional history were exposed on a site called Doxbin. At the time, I had no idea what it was. I barely understood what he had said. Today, just hearing or reading that name still sends a chill down my spine. For those who have never heard of it, Doxbin or Doxbin, with variations in the name, I've heard it's active again, is a site that cannot be accessed by common browsers. It exists in what they call the dark web, or as Marcus preferred to say, the deep web. Basically, it's an internet space that can only be accessed with a special browser, invisible to Chrome or any other conventional one. Marcus said that if I wanted, he could teach me how to install this browser and see everything for myself. I thought it better for him to just send me some screenshots. When I saw the images, I was incredulous. Someone, without me knowing who, had published all my personal information, accompanied by serious accusations. The post claimed that I had several convictions related to crimes against minors. It alleged that I presented myself as a normal person, but was actually a pedophile trying to restart life after legal proceedings in Kentucky and Tennessee. That's when everything started to make sense. The strange man staring at me in the garage, the feces on my door, the destroyed car, the punch in the middle of the street. It all fit together. What seemed like a random sequence of events was actually a direct consequence of that absurd post. But the supposed anonymous source of the accusation wasn't so anonymous after all. Marcus, with his technology skills, decided to investigate who could hate me so much as to try to destroy my life. He checked my name and found no real accusations, then went back to the Doxbin post and confirmed that everything was an elaborate lie. He then began a new search to discover who would have reasons to do something like this. That's when he cross-referenced information about people who had recently left the company where I worked. Marcus found a former employee who seemed familiar with the world of special browsers, used to access this internet underworld. Additionally, he he discovered that this same subject had a public blog. By comparing the writing style of the blog with the text posted on Doxbin, he noticed an impressive similarity. Marcus explained all this quickly, while I practically begged to know the suspect's name. When he finally told me, it was as if everything suddenly became clear. I won't mention the name here because I prefer to maintain some decency and not expose the responsible party. But at the time, I recognized him immediately. It was the man who had undergone an evaluation conducted by me, resulting in his dismissal. He was sloppy, frequently late, and barely did his own work. But behind that unkempt appearance was someone extremely skilled with computers, and, as it turned out, deeply resentful. After his dismissal, I heard rumors that his life had completely fallen apart. He lost the apartment where he lived and was evicted a few weeks later. His wife, according to colleagues, filed for divorce shortly thereafter. It was as if the dismissal had triggered a chain reaction of personal disasters. Although I knew my evaluation was fair and professional, he seemed to see me, and only me, as responsible for everything. The anger he harbored wasn't just for having lost his job. It was as if I were the symbol of everything that had gone wrong in his life. When he found out it was me who had prepared the report that led to his exit, he swore he would make my life hell. I remember sitting in the hotel, holding the phone in one hand while pressing my temples with the other, trying to contain an impending migraine. It was too much information to process at once, and I was torn between the idea that this could be a scam and the feeling that Marcus was really telling the truth. When asked for proof of everything he was saying, he showed me details that were too accurate to be just a prank. Besides, Marcus was willing to reveal at least his own identity. If it were a scam, it would be absurdly elaborate. Even so, paranoia returned in full force when Marcus, at the end of the call, asked for money. He explained that he could remove the post, but it would be urgent work. The longer the post remained active, the more danger I was in. To resolve this quickly, he would need to pay friends who would help in the process, and I would have to transfer several $1,000s in Bitcoin. At that moment, my internal alarm went off. I asked directly if he himself might be the author of the post, trying to blackmail me. He gave a nervous little laugh and agreed that it would be a brilliant plan, but reinforced that if he were only interested in money, there were much easier ways to scam or extort someone. This ended up convincing me. Marcus did what he promised. The post was removed. During the following days, he continued calling to remind me of the debt and to confirm if anything else had happened. According to him, there was a chance my old apartment would suffer another attack, but only by those who already knew the address and believed the accusations. However, without the post, it was unlikely that new vigilantes would appear. I still suspected it was all a setup, but as the days passed and no new problems arose at the building, I began to relax. On the 10th day, I converted the money to Bitcoin and sent it to the wallet Marcus provided me. The process was complicated, but in the end, he called to thank me. And I, in a way, ended up thanking him even more. Right after hanging up, I decided to call back. I wanted to ask if I could hire his services again, if I needed to in the future. To my surprise, when I dialed, I heard a message saying the number had been disconnected. In the following days, paranoia began to return. I decided to think of a way to verify if Marcus had been honest. The idea came when I contacted the HR department one afternoon while still at the hotel. I dialed a number I had written down. A few seconds later, I heard the voice of the former colleague, whom I had negatively evaluated, the same one whose dismissal I had helped to conduct. I adopted the friendliest tone possible. I said I had heard about his termination and that I was sorry about it. He seemed surprised but not alarmed, so I continued. I mentioned that I had heard about a vacancy at another company and asked if he would like to be informed if something came up. He, still a bit confused, replied yes. In the end, as we said goodbye with a cordial thanks, "Talk to you later," I concluded with, "I know what you did." Any innocent person would have responded with something like, "What? What did I do?" But he didn't say anything. There was that heavy silence, as if he were thinking about how to respond or trying to find something that could turn the game in his favor. However, he didn't speak. He just hung up, and for me, that was enough. It was the confirmation I needed. If Marcus had been lying or in collusion with my former colleague, it would be an absurd coincidence that his silence had been so revealing. But from the way he reacted, or rather acted, it was clear that he knew exactly what I was implying. It was as if he were aware that the call could be being recorded, and indeed it was. I used my laptop camera to record the conversation in hopes of getting some direct confession. He, however, didn't give any chance. He knew that silence was his best strategy, because any additional word could complicate things for him. In the end, he went unpunished. There were no real consequences for him. But on my part, I got what I needed most, peace of mind. Now I understood the entire chain of events, from the origin to the developments. And although it was a terrible experience, at least I finally could put the pieces of the puzzle together and move forward. Today, I no longer live in Chicago. In fact, not even in the Midwest. I also no longer work with market research, and honestly, I'm okay with that. My life has changed, but I've found happiness in new paths. If there's something this story has taught me, and that I'd like to share, it's this. Be very careful with the information you share online. There are disturbed, truly dangerous people who can use even the smallest details against you. Protect yourself, and never underestimate what someone with bad intentions is capable of doing. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. I never believed in the supernatural until that winter night in northern Maine. My name is Thomas, and what I'm about to share happened in a small logging town called Pinewood Hollow, just outside Bangor. This experience wasn't mine, but my father's. Dad worked as a long-haul trucker, spending weeks on the road. Because of his job, my childhood memories of him are sparse and scattered. When I was barely 18 months old, my mother and I frequently traveled between our isolated cabin and Portland for her work commitments. During one particularly harsh February night in 1986, while we were away, my father found himself alone in our modest wooden cabin. Though simple, it was cozy and comfortable. Among our few possessions was a small hand-carved figurine, a lumberjack with an old-fashioned flannel shirt and a wide-brimmed hat that partially obscured the face. It was a classic representation of Maine's logging heritage, the kind you'd find in local craft shops. That night, Dad was resting in his armchair, trying to recover his strength before his next cross-country haul. He had just drifted off when he felt a sharp tug on his sleeve that jolted him awake. Startled but exhausted, he decided to ignore it, attributing the sensation to his fatigue. From where he sat, he could see the wooden figurine in the corner of the room, seemingly undisturbed. He shifted in his chair and tried to forget the incident. However, minutes later, something made his blood run cold. Light footsteps crossed the room, small steps like mine when I would toddle around the cabin during the day. "Sarah," he called out, thinking my mother might have returned with me. The silence that answered was deafening. As he turned in his chair, he realized he was completely alone. The dark winter night was visible through the frost-covered windows, and the figurine remained motionless in the corner. Yet something about it seemed off, as if it had shifted slightly from its usual position. Irritated, Dad got up, grabbed the figurine, and placed it outside on the porch by the door. Even from inside, he could see its outline through the frosted glass. Exhausted, he returned to his chair and fell asleep almost immediately. He wasn't asleep long before being awakened again, this time by soft knocking at the door. "Coming," he mumbled, still half asleep. He checked his watch, an old Timex that glowed in the dark, used more for checking the time than anything else. It was nearly 4 in the morning, more precisely 3:56. As he sat up in his chair, he glanced toward the door and froze. The figurine was no longer there. For a moment, he thought someone might have taken it, which infuriated him. He jumped up and went outside to look for it, searching the porch area, but found no trace of the wooden piece. It was then that he heard a sound behind him, a thin, high-pitched, childish giggle that sent chills down his spine. Overcome with fear, he ran back inside. When he entered the cabin, terror washed over him. The figurine was there, behind his chair, in the exact same position as before, as if patiently waiting for him. Furious and filled with a courage he didn't understand, Dad grabbed it again, shouting in rage and using words I won't repeat here. He threw it outside once more, this time farther into the yard. Though his reaction seemed bold, fear was silently growing behind his anger. He went back to his chair, but the sounds soon started again. This time, the knocking at the door was unmistakable. He approached slowly and looked out. What he saw made his heart stop for a moment. On the other side of the door, that thing no longer resembled a simple figurine. It was moving in a grotesque manner, as if trying to assume a human form. Its movements were erratic and awkward, as if each limb was contorting at impossible angles. Faced with this sight, terror overcame him. He curled up in his chair, covering himself with a blanket while reciting prayers. His thoughts immediately went to my mother and me. He silently begged for this nightmare to end, that he might see us again. In the midst of this whirlwind of fear and exhaustion, he eventually fell asleep. The sound of the door opening woke him. My mother and I had returned. He leapt up and embraced us, especially me, with an intensity he had never shown before, a mixture of relief and lingering fear. Without delay, he told my mother what had happened. She was surprised, though she had never noticed anything unusual about the figurine. From that day forward, that object never entered our home again. Today, my parents are divorced, and our conversations are less frequent. However, the last time I visited my father in Maine, we reminisced about this episode together. The story of how an apparently harmless figurine transformed into something far beyond understanding. Something he describes as a woodland spirit, or, to use his words, something not of this world, which neither he nor anyone in our family could or will ever comprehend. Curiously, sometime later, when we moved to Portland, that figurine simply vanished despite having packed all our belongings carefully. It disappeared without leaving any trace. The mystery remains, and the only certainty we have is that, on that winter night, something inexplicable and terrifying crossed paths with our family. I want to start by saying that maintaining my anonymity is important to me. I hope that's not a problem. What I'm about to share is undoubtedly one of the strangest and most disturbing experiences I've ever lived through. During these events, I confess that I had no idea what was happening or where it was leading. I hope that by the end, you'll understand what I mean. I'm from Vermont, specifically a small town near Burlington. I won't go into details about the exact street where this occurred, but I can say it was in the vicinity of Pine Creek, between several neighborhoods in that area. When I explain my reasons, it will be clear why I prefer not to specify the exact location. Some time ago, I moved into a small housing complex consisting of just 3 cottages. There was a simple communal courtyard, but the cottages themselves were surprisingly spacious. The rent was excellent, and living there made my routine easier since the Veterans Hospital where I worked was only a few minutes' walk away. During the first few months, my life there was completely peaceful. I usually left very early for work, and at that hour, I would always cross paths with my next-door neighbor, a woman around 70 years old, short in stature, with a fragile appearance. She was the type of person who exuded kindness and always greeted me with a warm smile. The other neighbor, a man in his early 30s, was practically a stranger since we rarely encountered each other. Our interactions were limited to occasional nods when I arrived in the afternoon. Weeks passed in this rhythm. The elderly woman was friendly, and even with our limited contact, I felt a certain joy in greeting her before starting my day. However, things began to change unexpectedly. On certain nights, around 1 in the morning, I would be awakened by the sound of knocking on the wall, as if someone was pounding on the other side of the partition, precisely where my elderly neighbor's cottage stood. The noises didn't seem to be hammering or repairs. They had a constant rhythm that lasted about 2 minutes, long enough to leave me intrigued, but they would soon cease, and I could go back to sleep. This happened for 3 consecutive nights. On the 3rd night, I decided I needed to understand what was going on, but I only found the courage to ask the following morning. When leaving for work, I encountered my neighbor as usual and casually commented, "Good morning, Mrs. Abernathy. I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but I have to ask, were you fixing something last night?" She responded in a calm but firm manner, "No, dear. I go to bed early." I continued somewhat awkwardly, "Oh, I'm sorry. It's just that for several nights now, I've been hearing knocking coming from your cottage. as if someone was hitting the wall. You didn't hear anything. The moment I finished speaking, I noticed something change in her expression. Her already pale skin became even paler as she stared fixedly at her cottage and murmured, "Oh my Lord, what could that be? They're not trying to fright me, are they? I'll stop by the store and get some candles. Don't worry, dear, and thank you for letting me know." I felt terrible for having frightened her so much. Despite this, something inside me insisted there was nothing supernatural happening. I'm skeptical about such things, and thought perhaps she was embarrassed to admit she was making noise at night. I decided to let it go and continue with my routine, but the thought stayed with me for the rest of the day. 2 days later, the knocking returned, this time more intense, to the point of waking me again. An uncomfortable thought began to cross my mind. What if, after my comment, my neighbor had interpreted it as a complaint and was trying to deliberately annoy me? But I quickly dismissed the idea. Mrs. Abernathy had always been so kind. It seemed impossible that she would do something like that. Even so, the sounds continued, and I resolved to ignore them. Over the next 2 weeks, the episodes repeated. By my calculation, I was awakened 6 times by the same noise, always during the early morning hours. I didn't bring up the subject with my neighbor again, firstly because I feared I had offended her, and secondly because I hardly ever saw her anymore. She always seemed hurried, greeting me without making direct eye contact, before quickly tending to her plants and retreating inside. Then something unexpected happened. One afternoon, returning from work, I came upon a commotion on the street where our housing complex was located. The area was surrounded by isolation tape, with police vehicles, military vehicles, and medical examiner vans. The activity was intense, and residents from the surrounding area were kept at a distance. I immediately recognized some colleagues from work. At that time, I was employed at the Veterans Hospital at a nearby base. As I approached to understand what was happening, they quickly realized I lived in the complex. "You live next door to Mrs. Abernathy?" one asked. I found it strange that they knew her name, but I confirmed. Nervousness began to overtake me. 1,000 possibilities ran through my mind, from a break-in to something related to the fact that I worked at a military facility. But when I noticed they knew Mrs. Abernathy, I was completely lost. Why would all that apparatus be related to her? One of my colleagues, in a reserved tone, called me to speak in a more secluded corner. He asked me to keep confidential what he was about to say. "I'm telling you this because you live next door and have a right to know. We've been monitoring this woman's cottage for some time. It wasn't her directly that we were after, but we knew that individuals, you know the type, frequented the place. We suspected the cottage was being used to store contraband or something of the sort. Today, with authorization, we conducted the operation. The story I heard next left me speechless. We found more than we expected. In the back of one of the bedrooms, there were 7 people tied up, suspended. They were from a rival group. When we entered this morning, they had just died. The scene was terrible. And the most absurd part, she confessed, said she did everything alone. Can you believe it? Did you never notice anything unusual? Still stunned, I could only stammer that I hadn't. and then mentioned the knocking on the wall I had been hearing at night, hoping to understand if it had any connection. He looked at me, visibly disturbed, and replied, "That makes a lot of sense. Today, when we found the bodies, they hadn't been dead long, as I said. But there was something else. None of them had feet. The feet were there in the cottage, but she had removed them. This woman, my friend, is completely out of her mind. She was taken away early this morning." The sensation of hearing this was indescribable. I couldn't process everything. It seemed like a nightmare. Reporting this may seem simple, but living through this experience was something completely different. Imagine what it's like to sleep in a cottage, sharing a wall with another where people were forcibly held, meeting a terrible end, and realizing that the sounds you heard were the expected blows from these people. Sleeping there afterward was practically impossible. At work, I made sure not to delve into the subject. I wanted distance. Still, colleagues from other areas of the base would come to ask me about Mrs. Abernathy, curious about the case. A week later, something frightening happened. In the silence of the early morning, I awoke again to the sound of knocking coming from the shared wall with her cottage. But this time, the cottage was completely empty. My colleague had told me that Mrs. Abernathy had no family nearby, as she was originally from Maine. The cottage was sealed off, still under investigation. Nobody had been there in the last few days. Yet the knocking continued. I went outside to check and saw that everything remained isolated dark, with the caution tape still in place. But the sounds wouldn't stop. From outside, I could clearly hear they were coming from the back of the cottage, exactly as before. I convinced myself it was just fear or suggestion, that my mind was playing tricks on me. I tried to ignore it, but that night, the noises lasted more than 5 minutes. The intensity was such that the clock hanging on my wall began to sway. Completely terrified, I locked myself in my bedroom, turned on the television to a high volume, and waited for dawn. When I woke up, I realized the living room clock had fallen to the floor. At work, I sought out the same colleague and told him what had happened. I asked him point blank if by chance they had released Mrs. Abernathy. After all, it made no sense for someone to be in that cottage. I don't believe in ghosts. His response chilled me. "No, buddy. Didn't they tell you? The same night they arrested Mrs. Abernathy, she died in her cell before she could even be processed. Look at me. This woman was a witch or something like that. You know what appeared in the autopsy? They found strange things in her stomach, like balls of hair, worms. Nobody understands what happened. They say that's what killed her. But what you just told me, are you sure of what you saw?" I confirmed, even more confused. He said he needed to alert the police to check the cottage, because it made no sense at all. He left in a hurry while I tried to continue my day. When I returned home that night, I found my colleague parked on the street in a patrol car with another companion. He called me to talk privately and looked completely pale. We went in there just a little while ago with some officers. We had permission. You won't believe what we saw. Only me and the officer who was with me saw Mrs. Abernathy in the room where everything happened. Her forehead was badly bruised. Now I know what you heard last night. She was banging her head against the wall. When we saw her, the door to that room closed by itself. The other officers quickly dispersed, frightened. When we managed to get back in, Mrs. Abernathy was no longer there. There was no sign of anyone, just the mess in the room. As you can imagine, the officer and I avoided commenting on anything with the rest of the team. But between ourselves, we admitted what we saw. We know this could never be officially registered, but believe me, we saw it. My colleague gave me direct advice. It would be better for me to find another place to live. He was serious, visibly concerned. He stayed there until I gathered my few belongings and accompanied me to the lodging that the base made available for those who needed temporary shelter. I spent a few days there without touching on the subject again. My colleague also didn't seem willing to talk about it anymore, and to be honest, I was even less so. Later, I informed my superior that I would no longer be staying in the housing complex. Soon I found a place near the base to rent. I moved out and never heard anything more related to Mrs. Abernathy. I know this story might seem difficult to believe. I admit that I would think the same if I hadn't lived through it all myself. But it's the truth. Everything I heard, what my colleagues saw, happened in that housing complex. A place where you would never imagine something like this. There's no use looking for news, because you won't find anything. None of this was made public. The report and investigation exist, but are confidential, restricted to internal records. And of course, nobody besides us knows what we really witnessed in that cottage, much less what I heard and what my companions saw. My name is Sarah, and I live in a small coastal town called Pine Haven on the rugged Oregon coast. There's a winding stretch of road between my hometown and Whispering Cove, a secluded beach area where my family and I experienced one of the most terrifying nights of our lives. Whispering Cove was our favorite getaway spot. We'd visit whenever we could to enjoy the pristine beaches and refreshing ocean breeze. We always came prepared with swimsuits, towels, snacks, and everything else we needed for a perfect weekend retreat. What I'm about to share happened in the autumn of 2015 and remains seared into my memory. I was 19 then, and my younger brother Jake was 15. We were heading out for a weekend trip on a Friday evening because my father could only leave work late. Even though it was just 7:30, the sky had already turned pitch black. A heavy fog had rolled in from the Pacific, shrouding everything in a thick, misty blanket. We usually rented a cabin for the weekend from my father's cousin, who lived near Whispering Cove. The journey took us along a treacherous coastal road, with sharp turns hugging the cliffside. Because of this, my father always drove cautiously, especially in poor weather conditions. My mother sat in the passenger seat, while I gazed absently out the rear window. The radio played softly in the background. The volume kept low, because Jake had fallen asleep beside me. As we navigated around a particularly tight bend, the landscape opened up to a series of rolling hills and dense forest on either side. This stretch of road was notoriously isolated. No houses, no streetlights, just wilderness and the narrow asphalt cutting through it. Suddenly, my father began to slow down, eventually bringing the car to a complete stop. Curious, I leaned forward between the front seats and noticed my parents whispering intensely about someone on the road. Looking ahead, I saw an elderly woman hunched over, wearing what appeared to be an old-fashioned shawl draped over her head. She was waving for us to stop. My mother, visibly uneasy, urged my father to keep driving, concerned it might be some kind of trap. But my father insisted it was just an old woman who probably needed assistance. While they debated, we remained stopped beside her. My mother, still suspicious, lowered her window just slightly. My father, trying to be courteous, asked how he could help. The woman didn't respond to his question. Instead, she walked directly to the rear door where I was sitting and tried to open it. She pulled on the handle calmly, repeatedly saying the same words, "Open for me." The scene left me paralyzed with fear. Although the car was locked, the sound of the handle being pulled was persistent and unnervingly deliberate. My father, now clearly uncomfortable, tried again to ask what she needed, but received no answer. Then suddenly, my mother let out a scream so piercing that it still echoes in my mind years later. It was a cry of pure terror, and in that moment, I knew she had seen something truly horrifying. Without asking any questions, my father slammed his foot on the accelerator, speeding away around the curves while my mother sobbed uncontrollably, repeating in a state of shock, "She had no eyes. She had no eyes." The commotion was so intense that it jolted Jake awake. Still groggy and confused, he asked what was happening. My father, attempting to calm everyone down, muttered that it must have been a misunderstanding, that the darkness and fog had played tricks on our vision. But my mother, still trembling violently, insisted, "I saw her clearly. She had no eyes, just empty sockets." The heavy silence that followed was suffocating. My father continued driving, his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel too tightly, while Jake and I exchanged bewildered glances, unsure what to think. My mother kept insisting between sobs that she had seen everything clearly. According to her, the woman's face had been pressed very close to the window, and where her eyes should have been, there were only hollow cavities. She covered her face with her hands, weeping, which only intensified the dread I felt spreading through my body. None of us knew what to say. Only my father tried to reassure her, saying we had left that thing far behind us and wouldn't encounter it again. But his voice quavered as he spoke, betraying his own fear. As we continued driving, the strangest thing happened. The fog seemed to thicken around our car, making it almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. My father had to slow down again, much to everyone's dismay. That's when I noticed something in the side view mirror, a dark silhouette moving through the mist, keeping pace with our car, despite the fact that we were driving at least 30 miles per hour. "Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "I think she's following us." Before he could respond, the car radio, which had been playing soft music all this time, suddenly emitted a burst of static so loud that we all jumped. Through the white noise, we could make out a faint voice saying, "Open for me. Open for me." Jake started crying now too, and my father pressed the accelerator harder, navigating the dangerous curves with a recklessness I'd never seen in him before. The fog parted occasionally, revealing glimpses of the ocean crashing against the rocks below, a sheer drop of hundreds of feet if we veered too far to the right. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only 15 minutes, we finally saw the welcoming lights of the coastal highway that would lead us to more populated areas. As soon as we joined the main road, the fog mysteriously dissipated, the radio returned to normal, and the oppressive feeling that had gripped us all began to lift. We never made it to Whispering Cove that night. Instead, we checked into a motel along the highway and huddled together in one room, too scared to be separated. After that incident, we avoided traveling to Whispering Cove for years. To this day, we've never been able to fully understand what happened that night. We all saw and heard the woman, but because of the darkness and viewing through the rear window, my view was limited. My mother, however, was right there in the passenger seat and saw every detail up close. I still wonder what might have happened if our car doors hadn't been locked that night. Sometimes, when I'm driving along that stretch of coastal highway and the fog starts to roll in, I can't help but check my rearview mirror, half expecting to see a hunched figure with a shawl over her head, waiting for someone to stop and open their door for her. Local legends say she was a lighthouse keeper's wife who lost her husband and children to the sea during a violent storm in the 1800s. Driven mad by grief, she threw herself from the cliffs, but her spirit never found peace. They say she seeks to lure travelers to the same fate, particularly those with families, perhaps out of jealousy, perhaps out of a twisted desire for company in her eternal solitude. Whether you believe in ghost stories or not, if you ever find yourself driving the coastal road between Pine Haven and Whispering Cove on a foggy night, my advice is simple. Don't stop for anyone. Keep your doors locked. And whatever you do, don't look too closely at the faces peering in from the darkness. My name is Emily Carter. If this incident had happened years ago, I probably wouldn't have revealed my identity. But now, it doesn't make any difference since I no longer work at that bookstore. You know, the one with the distinctive Victorian gentleman mascot mannequin wearing a top hat and tails. I didn't leave because of anything negative. On the contrary, it was a very positive experience. I worked there between 2008 and 2010 in Chicago, in the downtown area near the River North District. During my first 8 months, it was rare to see the mannequin moved around. Our manager would reposition it about once every 2 weeks, sometimes even less frequently. Our branch didn't make much use of the mannequin for attracting customers like other locations did. I mention this because after months of seeing that Victorian gentleman mannequin always standing in the same corner of our staff room, something unusual happened. At that time, only myself and an older colleague named Margaret, who was in her 40s, worked the morning shift. On what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday, we opened the store together and were casually discussing our weekend plans. Margaret went to help a customer, while I stayed at the computer, organizing the new inventory that had arrived that morning. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something strange. The mannequin, which had been covered with a navy blue dust cloth, appeared to have shifted position. I looked directly at it, thinking it might be tipping over, but no, it remained firmly in the same spot. Perhaps it was just my imagination, or a draft moving the cover slightly. At that moment, Margaret called me over to help find a rare book that a customer had pre-ordered, but wasn't showing up in our system. We searched together without success, and ended up suggesting another bookstore across town that specialized in rare editions. After the customer left, we returned our attention to the back room and saw, through the half-open door, the mannequin. It was still covered, but now standing in the middle of the room rather than in its usual corner. We exchanged glances, unable to speak a word. The next instant, we heard a soft rustling sound, and the mannequin simply rotated slightly, as if turning to face us, before becoming completely still again. Margaret, visibly shaken, called out our manager's name, pleading for him to stop scaring us, though we both knew he wasn't scheduled to come in until the afternoon shift. Determined, Margaret approached and lifted the dust cloth covering the mannequin. To our astonishment, it was just the wooden mannequin underneath. No hidden mechanism. No person inside, not that anyone could fit inside it anyway. She gave me a look of pure bewilderment, dropped the cloth back over the mannequin, and we both retreated quickly to the front of the store. Outside in the main shop area, we tried to make sense of what we had witnessed. We both confirmed seeing the mannequin move from the corner to the center of the room. And then, that subtle rotation, as if it had turned to acknowledge our presence. It made no logical sense. Our manager, who occasionally repositioned the mannequin, hadn't even been in the store that day, and we ourselves had opened up that morning, finding everything exactly as it had been left the night before. Despite our unease, the steady stream of customers kept us occupied for the rest of the day, though we couldn't stop casting suspicious glances toward the staff room door. That evening, after closing, Margaret insisted we check the mannequin together. When we entered the room, it was back in its original corner position, as if it had never moved at all. I can hardly believe what happened, especially because both of us saw the same thing. A week later, when our manager came in to dress the mannequin in new seasonal attire, I casually asked if he knew anything about its history. He mentioned that it was an original piece from the early 1900s and had been with the bookstore since it first opened in 1972. He added, almost as an afterthought, that the previous manager used to joke that the mannequin had belonged to a stage magician who died performing a vanishing act. I don't have many more details to share, because that was the only time in 2 years that something so inexplicable occurred. Eventually, the old mannequin was replaced with a more modern display figure, and the Victorian gentleman was supposedly donated to a local history museum. Still, on quiet mornings when I would open the store alone, I sometimes found myself wondering if that mannequin had something special about it, or if what we experienced was just a strange coincidence. To this day, whenever I pass by an antique shop with mannequins in the window, I can't help but look twice to make sure they're staying perfectly still. Tonight, I want to share the strangest experience I've ever had, something that terrified me deeply at the time. I'm from Millbrook, a small town in upstate New York. This happened about 15 years ago when I worked for a delivery company that no longer exists. The incident occurred during the final years of that company's operation. The company was absolute chaos in terms of organization, but somehow packages always arrived on time. The real problem was their vehicle fleet, always in short supply. They'd loan vehicles to other branches or purchase models so old and worn down that they frequently broke down. Because of this, we were instructed to find alternative transportation methods when necessary, receiving funds to cover those expenses. It was in one of these situations that something truly worth telling happened. I had a good friend, let's call him Marcus, who drove for a local shuttle service in Millbrook. By luck, he was off that night. Marcus wasn't the type to use his free time for partying, so knowing he'd be available, I made him a proposal. The company gave us enough money for transportation. No wonder they went bankrupt, spending so carelessly while cutting corners on crucial aspects. I suggested that Marcus drive me to Hudson Valley, a town approximately 1 hour and 20 minutes away, in exchange for a good portion of the money provided by the company. It was just 3 small packages to deliver. He accepted, and we departed in the early evening. On the way, engrossed in animated conversation, we were quite close friends. We became distracted and forgot to refuel the shuttle van. With the little fuel we had, we knew we wouldn't reach our final destination, but maybe we could make it to a gas station along the route. The trouble began when we passed 2 gas stations. One was out of fuel because the delivery truck was delayed, and the other didn't accept card payments, which was exactly how I had the company's money. Neither of us had a single cent in cash. All we could do was hope the next station was closer than we remembered, as we couldn't exactly recall where it was located. With the tank practically empty, chance led us to a rest area on the highway, one of those simple stops with a bathroom and a payphone, but no gas station. There we spotted a parked car. Our best idea was to stop and ask the driver if they knew where the next gas station was, or perhaps if they had equipment to transfer some fuel. We planned to explain the situation, show documents, the packages, the marked shuttle van, everything to avoid misunderstandings. As soon as we stopped, we noticed the car was turned off. Looking through the windows, we saw an old vehicle, deep burgundy, with a striking appearance. That car looked like it had come straight out of the 70s or early 80s. My friend, who knew something about cars, confirmed this. Despite its age, the car didn't look abandoned. On the contrary, it was impeccably clean, too clean, I'd say. Making no noise except for the sound of our own engine, we waited. Suddenly, from the bathroom, a small structure with 1 or 2 stalls, emerged a man who appeared to be about 40 years old. He wore a black button-up shirt tucked into formal pants, with elegant shoes. His extremely pale skin stood out, even in the darkness of night. The most intriguing detail, however, was that he wore dark sunglasses. I'll describe how everything happened. Whether you believe it or not doesn't matter. But the truth is that this man's clothes seemed to perfectly match the style of the car parked there. However, at the time, we didn't pay attention to this. We were desperate and only noticed these details later. He walked right past us, ignoring our presence as if there was nobody there. He continued on his way until my friend raised his voice to get his attention. The man stopped and calmly turned toward us. "Sir, can you help us?" We explained our situation hurriedly, almost tripping over our words. We presented various alternatives, offering grocery coupons, trading for some fuel, or any other solution he might suggest. We kept talking nonstop, trying to convey the urgency of the moment, but he said nothing. He stood there, motionless, staring at us with a completely blank expression, as if he didn't understand a single word we were saying. Without warning, a woman appeared. She came with 2 children, all dressed in an old-fashioned way. with clothes that seemed from another time period. Like the man, they wore dark sunglasses and had the same pale skin. But the strangest thing was realizing where they had come from. This rest area was isolated, surrounded by a fence approximately 6 feet high with only one entrance, the same one we had used to arrive. However, they didn't come from the bathroom or any other obvious direction, but rather from the middle of the wooded area beyond the fence. We greeted the woman and children, trying to appear friendly. "Good evening," we said, but just like the man, they remained serious and silent. The woman alternated her gaze between us and the man, as if trying to understand the situation. The little girl, still holding her mother's hand, took a few steps in our direction, stared fixedly at us from behind her glasses without any expression, and then retreated. Before we could say anything else, my friend abruptly ended the conversation. "Thank you anyway, good night." With a firm gesture, he pulled my arm and pushed me into the car. I noticed he was pale, almost as if he had seen a ghost. As soon as we closed the doors, he accelerated, leaving in a hurry. "What happened?" "We needed their help," I asked, confused. He was driving as if fleeing from something, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. That wasn't people," he said gravely. "What do you mean they weren't people? Didn't you see their faces?" They were melting. They weren't human. Pray we reach somewhere safe before the gas runs out." A chill ran down my spine hearing that. Fear completely overtook me. I hadn't noticed their faces that closely, but something about that situation really didn't seem normal. Who were those people? Where did they come from? Why were they dressed that way? And the car and the sunglasses. I kept looking back, trying to see them through the window and rearview mirror. But soon the darkness of the highway swallowed them up. My friend didn't slow down until we spotted a gas station. We arrived there by sheer luck, with the last traces of fuel in the tank. An attendant came to help us. We didn't even get out of the car. We requested fuel, and fortunately, he accepted card payment. He noticed we were trembling and asked what we had encountered on the road. We avoided going into details. My friend only responded that we weren't sure what it was. While finishing refueling the car, the man looked at us and said something we never forgot. Whatever it was we had seen, it was better to avoid stops in dark places. He recommended that we only stop at gas stations or convenience stores because, according to him, very strange things tended to appear in that region. We didn't ask anything more. The fear was greater than curiosity. We just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible and reach the city. My friend accelerated again, and when we finally arrived at our destination, we stayed awake until dawn in silence, still in shock. We never spoke again about what happened that night. The fright and fear were too strong to revisit the subject. Over time, I passed through that stretch of highway again, but only during the day. I never had the courage to face that road at night again. Fortunately, I also didn't need to work that shift anymore. That rest area with the bathrooms remained empty for a long time, until it was completely demolished. Today, there's nothing there anymore. I don't know exactly what my friend saw or what I saw, but I clearly remember his words. That wasn't people. A few months after the incident, Marcus moved to another state. He never mentioned that night again, but I noticed he stopped driving night shifts for the shuttle service. As for me, I've spent years researching unexplained phenomena in the Hudson Valley region. I've found stories of other travelers encountering strange pale figures near abandoned rest stops along that stretch of highway. Always at night, always wearing sunglasses regardless of the hour. Some local legends speak of a family who died in a terrible accident there in the early 80s. A burgundy car that caught fire, trapping everyone inside. The stories say that sometimes they appear to stranded travelers, but no one who accepts their help is ever seen again. I don't know if what we encountered that night were ghosts, something supernatural, or just my imagination playing tricks in the darkness. But whenever I drive at night and see a rest area on an empty stretch of road, I keep driving, no matter how low my fuel gauge reads. Some encounters are better left as fleeting moments in the dark. My name is Samuel, and my story takes you back to 2019, 5 years ago, in the remote wilderness of northern Montana. Back then, I was in my 3rd year of studying natural resource management at the University of Montana. One of the degree requirements was to complete at least 2 internships or academic field experiences. Not having any connections to help me find suitable placements, I was assigned by the university to an institution related to my field of study. That's how I ended up being selected for a rural technical assistance program designed to support rural communities and farmers. There were about 120 students distributed across various regions of the state. By coincidence, 11 classmates and I were sent to a remote area near the Blackfoot Indian Reservation in northwestern Montana. It wasn't far from where I was born, which initially gave me a sense of relief, thinking I'd be relatively close to family. At least that's what I thought. We were told we would be working in various communities across the county, with emphasis on assisting indigenous populations. Despite expecting something different, what I found upon arrival was an essentially rural zone inhabited by people living off agriculture and livestock. To cover the entire area assigned to us, we were divided into 3 groups with 4 members each. My team consisted of Arthur, Rachel, Paige, and myself. We were the last group to be allocated, and when we reached our destination around 4 in the afternoon, we faced a challenging reality. Families surviving on basic crops and cattle raising, without access to electricity or running water. For those not accustomed to such conditions, the situation was a genuine test of endurance. Fortunately, we were lucky enough to stay in an abandoned facility that previously served as a shelter for pregnant women. This at least guaranteed us a place to sleep with actual beds, something the other 2 groups didn't have. One of the first things I noticed was that we were close to a mountain ridge. Being the only one on the team born in that region, I was familiar with the stories surrounding the place. People spoke of disappearances, possessions, and even tales of an enormous black bull associated with dark pacts. All of these occurred in a location known as Saddle Rock, on what locals called Whisper Ridge. I shared these stories with my colleagues, but everyone dismissed them since our focus was on work. However, it was precisely in this place that strange occurrences began. Imagine this. At night, the silence was absolute until unexplainable sounds suddenly emerged. Sometimes we heard wings flapping outside. Other times, heavy footsteps like boots echoing in a nearby room. But we never saw anything. These sounds seemed to have no origin. At first, they were just isolated episodes, easy to ignore. But soon they started making us wonder if the local stories held some truth. As days passed, it became clear we were about to face even darker situations. The residents shared stories of supernatural events that they already regarded as part of their routine. One involved a local hunter who once climbed a tree during a night hunt and found himself surrounded by several deer. One of them, absurdly large with immense antlers, staring at him in a frightening manner. When he tried to fire his weapon, it failed. The strangest part was that the animal opened a smile, a wide, almost human smile, before slowly backing away. Another story mentioned a boy, now a teenager, whose life was transformed after a disturbing encounter. They said that one night, while leading cattle to the corral, he spotted something in the form of a child wearing worn, old-fashioned clothes. When he tried to scare the figure away, he became completely paralyzed. Since that event, the boy lost his ability to speak, and even when we met him, his behavior was unusual. We were told that before this episode, which he managed to document only in writing, he had been perfectly normal. After a few days, we were transferred to another location, leaving behind the sounds of footsteps, wings, and noises on the roof. This time we were housed with a simple family consisting of just 3 people. However, something in that area affected us much more intensely. We were closer to the ridge and to the second group, and the atmosphere around seemed different, as if the very energy of the place had changed. Heavy, dense, charged with a sense of imminent threat that all of us noticed from the first moment. On the very first night, the feeling that we were being watched began. It was a visceral sensation, as if we were prey being stalked. There were no sounds or signs. It was just as if something was around us, circulating while we tried to rest. This perception persisted night after night, making sleep increasingly difficult. Due to the conditions of the place, we had to wake up before dawn, around 4 a.m, to bathe in the river since there was no running water. During these trips to the river in the dim light, we heard footsteps in the water and voices that seemed to emerge with the wind. It was as if something was lurking, watching us from the shadows. We always returned hastily, accompanied by this oppressive feeling of being monitored. One day, during a walk to another community, we stopped by the riverside to rest because we were disoriented and waiting to find someone who could help us with directions. Suddenly, we heard voices in the distance, as if a group of people were conversing. The voices, carried by the wind, seemed to approach, so we decided to wait and ask for information. However, nobody appeared. The voices continued, but there was no sign of any person. We decided to move forward, ignoring what happened until the voices changed. They began to laugh in a clear tone of mockery that echoed through the air. That night, while discussing the episode, the sensation of being watched returned with even more intensity. We all felt it. At one point, Arthur went out to go to the bathroom, which was about 30 yards from the house. Shortly after entering, he heard knocks on the door. Opening it immediately, he found no one, only darkness and some flashlights gleaming in the distance. The environment seemed suffocating, wrapped in a mystery that surrounded us at every moment. The next day, as we were heading to another destination, something even more disturbing happened. Without any warning, Arthur's phone turned on by itself and began taking photos automatically. There were more than 200 images, all directed at Paige. When he showed us, we were horrified by what we saw. The photos were disturbing. Some showed Paige's face deformed. Others captured shadows or silhouettes among the trees, figures lurking in the darkness. It was terrifying, especially because the phone could only be unlocked with Arthur's fingerprint, making it almost impossible for something like this to happen accidentally, and even more so focused exclusively on her. After that, Paige couldn't sleep alone anymore. But it wasn't just because of fear. She said she felt the blankets being pulled during the night, as if someone or something was watching her while she slept. I also sensed something. There was a darkness there, a feeling of constant danger. Rachel, who seemed to share this same perception, decided to sleep next to Paige to try to comfort her and prevent her from being alone. But the strange events didn't stop there. On a day off, we decided to go to the river to bathe. A local resident guided us to a beautiful place surrounded by trees. However, before we arrived, he crossed himself and warned us, "Make the sign of the cross because strange things happen here. It's beautiful, but many people have drowned mysteriously." Despite the warning, we ignored it, thinking it was just local folklore or typical superstitions of the region. Even in the face of everything we had experienced until then, it was easier to deflect the idea of imminent danger, as if by denying it, we could protect ourselves. And after all, we thought, what else could happen? The day went smoothly. Upon returning home, we decided to review the photos and videos we had recorded. That's when we noticed something terrifying in one of the videos. While the camera was supported on a tree to film the group swimming, you can clearly hear a laugh, a female laugh filled with mockery, as if someone was watching us. But the scariest part was that in the footage, absolutely no one appeared besides us. The nights were always marked by conversations about the strange occurrences, accompanied by that constant sensation that something or someone was always nearby, lurking. There was a weight in the air that surrounded us, that never left us. The last thing that happened to me was so vivid that to this day, I can't tell if it was a dream or reality. While sleeping on the floor in my sleeping bag, I remember opening my eyes and feeling the atmosphere around me extremely dense, almost suffocating. The darkness seemed to take over everything, as if it were alive. When I moved my head, I saw something crouched in front of me. It was a thin, skeletal creature with protruding bones that seemed to break through the thin skin of its back and visibly marked ribs. Its eyes were large, deep, shadowy. It had no hair, and what disturbed me most was the smile on its face, a smile that seemed to dig directly into my mind, burning itself into my memory. My entire body was paralyzed, unable to react. My heart was racing like never before, but I couldn't move or even scream. That expression, that smile, stayed with me to this day. I can see it when I close my eyes. Finally, I managed to react, and the creature disappeared immediately. However, upon fully waking up, I could clearly hear something moving in the vegetation around us. Whatever it was, it continued to prowl, watching us in the darkness. The following night, we made a decision. We would all sleep in the same room. And then it happened again, but this time it was different. A new figure appeared, tall, thin, a silhouette standing at the door of the room. We all woke up at the same time. We didn't exchange a word, but we all saw the same thing. That presence stared at us fixedly, motionless, without crossing the doorway, as if something was preventing it. At the back of the room, right in front of the door, there was an image of Saint Michael the Archangel. Perhaps it was this that served as the barrier that protected us that night. After this experience, we returned to the city to finalize our reports, but the experience left me with an important lesson. In any place, no matter how simple or isolated it may seem, there are hidden things. The local residents, perhaps already accustomed, live with these presences as part of their routine. For us, however, these experiences were profound, terrible, but impossible to forget. That was my experience, but the other two groups also went through similar situations. One of them reported hearing an elderly woman screaming every night that she was going to take her own life. Another group spotted a strange man near the ridge, as well as mysterious lights in the sky and figures that seemed to move in the shadows. This is my story. Perhaps it's not the scariest you've ever heard, but I assure you it's completely true. This experience made me believe that no matter where you are or where you come from, there's always something nearby, something that watches, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I hope you never encounter this thing, this trigger that awakens, manifests, and transforms you into the protagonist of your own horror story. I'm sharing a story with information that was once restricted, but has now come to light, revealing events that should have remained hidden. This is the account of someone who wishes to remain anonymous, as you'll soon understand. Please don't mention my name. I know my name appears in the email, even though I didn't include it in this account, so I ask for discretion. This isn't the type of work I regularly do, but having experience in areas related to the care of deceased individuals, I occasionally worked in morgues and mortuaries. Sometimes I cover for colleagues who can't make it to the hospital. This happens due to my background and training, not for any other reason. Besides, earning extra money is never a bad thing, especially because there's frequently a shortage of staff at this particular facility in northern Vermont. It's mutually beneficial. However, there's a practice that deeply disturbs me. Certain officials show up to access some bodies. They don't ask permission. They simply notify us politely that they'll be stopping by. They usually select unclaimed bodies, homeless individuals or those who lost contact with their families long ago and don't receive a proper burial. These bodies remain forgotten for weeks or months. It's an open secret what they do with them. Various stories circulate, some more exaggerated than others. But what we know for certain is that these officials remove certain parts of the bodies, primarily arms and legs. These parts are used to complete other bodies, creating a more suitable appearance for wakes and burials. Different versions exist, including rumors about other practices, but a senior morgue supervisor with extensive experience and many connections assured us, even before we witnessed it personally, that this is what generally happens. He's highly sought after in the sector, but even he can't refuse when they knock on the door requesting access. In my opinion, it's completely absurd and extremely disrespectful. Of course, The deceased who lost an arm or leg won't need them anymore. But there are families willing to pay any amount to make their loved ones appear whole during the wake. I suppose these are people of high financial means, for whom appearance at the funeral is an essential detail. The thing is, even those of us who work there oppose this unethical practice. But our hands are tied because the orders come from above. And there's another reason we detest this procedure. Whenever they disturb a deceased person's body, they say the night will be long. According to more experienced colleagues, the body reclaims what was taken. That's what I heard from a veteran, referring to events that followed these officials' visits. When we were left with bodies that no longer had all their parts, we had no choice but to continue our work. The problem was that we tried to dispose of these bodies as quickly as possible, respectfully. Of course, because spending the night with them in the morgue was terrifying. I admit I also participated in this attempt to normalize the situation, which I believe is a way of coping with the strange events that emerged. It wasn't constant, but it occurred more frequently than we would have liked. I can affirm that many times, as soon as a body returned, we heard knocking sounds coming from the compartments where they were stored. One situation that left a mark on me involved an elderly man. His body had been removed for about 2 hours. I don't know where to, and when it returned, it was already missing one of its legs. Although I already knew about this practice, it was the first time I experienced something truly out of the ordinary related to it. We stored the body in the compartment because there was nothing else to do. We just noted the absence of the leg and moved on. About half an hour later, my colleague and I were on site already in the morning when we heard knocking coming from that compartment. The noise was very loud, as if someone was desperately banging, even kicking to get out. It was terrifying, and the strangest thing was that the sound continued even when we stood in front of the compartment. My colleague, who had witnessed this before, pointed to the place where the tray lock was located. He commented that it was the 3rd time he had experienced this, but still felt afraid. I was also frightened, even knowing these things weren't unprecedented. He pulled out the tray, and to our shock, the body was completely disarranged, as if it had thrashed intensely inside the compartment. But what could we do? Nothing. It was evident that something inexplicable had occurred, but we couldn't allow the body to have marks that weren't previously recorded, risking facing problems. Therefore, we always checked. These occurrences were common, and when a body arrived missing a part, we already knew what to expect. The most disturbing thing was that the noise only stopped when we went to check. It never ceased on its own. I believed these manifestations were limited to this, until I experienced a case involving a child. She had been found on the streets, and no one had claimed her. Days later, people showed up with documents. We pretended to verify them, but there wasn't much we could do. Anyone who tried to oppose could end up harming themselves. They took the child and returned her later that night. I wasn't present when they removed her in the morning, but I saw when they brought her back. The report from the transport personnel was that the girl returned without her right forearm. What was most impressive was how they cleaned the area where the part had been removed, as if they wanted it to look as perfect as possible. I still had to deal with that body. One night, while taking materials for disposal at the end of a corridor, I heard footsteps behind me as I was returning. I was distracted with messages on my phone, and the footsteps were hurried, as if someone was running. I turned quickly, stepping aside, but there was no one there. Yet the footsteps continued, now in front of me, heading toward the morgue door. They stopped precisely there. It wasn't as if the door had opened by itself, just the sound of footsteps ceasing at that point. They were short, barefoot steps, seeming to belong to a child. I felt absolute fear and ran back down the corridor. When I entered, I found my shift colleague with eyes wide open, staring fixedly at the gurneys. With my heart racing, I asked, "Did you hear the footsteps too?" He shook his head and replied, "Footsteps. I just saw the girl running and hiding behind the cabinet. The same girl who arrived without an arm." "Let's get out of here." Without questioning, I agreed. We left the morgue and went up to the upper floor, which was practically empty at that hour. There we tried to calm down, but I still didn't understand how he had seen the girl, while I had only heard the footsteps. We went to the staff room, both trembling. I asked what we could do, and he just said nothing. We just had to wait for someone to come claim the body, but no one had officially claimed her, and she didn't even have identification. While we were talking, a colleague from the disposal area entered, visibly disturbed. He approached and spoke in a low voice. "You won't believe what happened to me, but I have proof." He was so agitated that he could barely explain. He sat down and lifted his pant leg. We all leaned in to look and saw something shocking. A bite mark on his right calf. It was small, clearly from a child. He recounted that while walking down the same corridor I described, he felt something grab his ankle and then a painful bite. He said that even in his shock, he managed to glimpse a girl running toward the morgue. But he didn't have the courage to go after her because he knew there would be no living child there, especially at that hour. The bite didn't disappear. It was visible and detailed, with clear marks of small teeth. We told him what had happened to us, and this only increased our unease. None of us wanted to return to the morgue, but we knew we couldn't avoid it forever. To try to contain the situation, my colleague took a rosary he carried on his keychain and hung it on the handle of the compartment where the girl's body was stored. This brought a bit of peace. For days, the rosary remained there, and everyone understood why after we reported the events. Even more so after seeing the bite on our colleague. The next morning, beyond these footsteps and noises, other strange reports always emerged in similar situations. But the case that generated the most repercussion, to the point that police were called, happened on another night. When I arrived for my shift, I saw 3 police officers in the morgue, acting discreetly. That day, 2 new employees had started. One hired a few weeks earlier, and another who was providing temporary services. Both were left alone at some point because the supervisor disappeared. And to make matters worse, not even the police could find him initially. I asked what had happened, and they explained that the 2 young men had seen a strange man opening the morgue door, putting only his head inside, laughing, and then leaving. When they ran after him down the corridor, they found no one, but soon he would reappear, this time at a window that gave onto a small storage room, repeating the same behavior. This game continued for a good while, until they decided to call security. The guard checked, but also found nothing, so they resolved to call the police. "We thought he wanted to steal something or take a body," the 2 explained, "because each time we looked, he was further inside the morgue. The police heard the description of the man and began searching for him discreetly. They found no one and decided to go upstairs to review the security cameras. When the supervisor finally appeared, the young men described the man again. I heard everything from nearby, and according to them, the man was missing his left arm. It was gone from the shoulder. The supervisor, with a serious expression, led the young men to the area where some bodies were kept. I followed them from a distance, curious and apprehensive. As soon as they saw a specific cadaver, they screamed in terror. "It's him!" They backed away, frightened, while the supervisor left the room with an expression that seemed to say he already knew what was happening. He gave me that look of this again. As the years passed, these events didn't stop happening, although less frequently than before. In the past, they would collect bodies in these conditions about 10 or 15 times a year, and paranormal phenomena were practically certain. Today they are less common, but still occur. I never forgot the phrase from an experienced colleague. Eventually, every body reclaims what is its own. There were many other disturbing cases, but I think what I've told gives a clear idea of how terrible it is when they take a body, do what they do, and we end up suffering the consequences. Because yes, when something is taken from them, they don't stay quiet, and we pay the price. We lived in a small town called Pine Hollow, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. My mother, Sarah, was a woman of incredible strength and determination, always working tirelessly to ensure a better future for me and my two younger siblings, Jamie and Lily. After my father abandoned us many years ago to start a new family elsewhere, never to be heard from again, we faced countless hardships. We survived on the bare minimum, depending on whatever cleaning and odd jobs my mother could find in other people's homes. As the oldest child, I began helping her from an early age. She always nurtured the dream of moving us to a larger town where, according to her, our chances for a better future would be greater. For years, my mother saved every penny, but her plans seemed to crumble when her health began to fail. Although not yet old, the years of hard labor had taken their toll, forcing her to stop working. With no alternatives, she decided to use her savings to open a small general store in our home. It was a risky gamble, but she had faith that God would be on our side. In Pine Hollow, there were only a couple of small shops, and none offered much variety. After finding a supplier in the nearest city, about 2 hours away, we began selling the basics: beans, rice, oil, soap bars, and even some candies for the children. At first, business was slow since hardly anyone knew about us. But over time, workers, housewives, and children started to appear. Sales grew, and soon we were able to expand our inventory, even offering fresh meat, something rare in our area. For the first time in a long while, we stopped living in scarcity. Our home came to life. I served the customers, my mother organized the products, and my siblings took care of cleaning. They were good times, and although still modest, we lived with respect and dignity. But as they say in our town, when everything seems to be going well, someone always tries to knock you down. One Sunday morning, as usual, we went to the 8 o'clock service at the Pine Hollow Baptist Church to give thanks for the blessings we received. Upon returning, Jamie, my younger brother, ran to the door to open it, but suddenly stopped, his face turning pale with shock. "Mom, come here quick." When we approached, what I saw left us paralyzed. Someone had drawn a circle with white powder right in front of our door, and in the center was the head of a black cat, still dripping blood, forming a dark pool on the ground. My mother quickly moved us away. "Stay back," she ordered, her voice trembling. She went inside, got a shovel and a broom, and with visible repulsion cleaned everything up. She threw the remains in a vacant lot and scrubbed the ground with water and bleach. Although she tried to appear firm, the fear was clear in her eyes. We knew this wasn't just a prank, it was witchcraft. Someone wanted to harm us. Days passed, but peace did not return. One morning, when opening the store, we found a cross made of bones placed on a mound of dirt at the entrance. Once again, my mother cleaned everything, but this time I noticed her hands trembling. "This isn't normal," she murmured. "They're trying to intimidate us." Something worse followed that only confirmed our greatest fears. Sales began to plummet. Regular customers stopped showing up, and the few people who still entered the store showed discomfort, as if something invisible was bothering them. To make matters worse, products began to spoil without any logical explanation. The meat, which was always kept in the refrigerator, would be infested with maggots within days. My mother, realizing that all her effort was crumbling, decided to close the business temporarily. It was evident that we were dealing with something beyond the natural, and we would need help to face what was coming. With the store closed, our home sank into a heavy, disturbing silence. My mother spent nights awake, drowning in worries about the future. Although she didn't say anything, the despair in her eyes was impossible to ignore. The store had been her big gamble, her main hope for better days, and seeing it fail due to something beyond our control was heartbreaking. One morning, as we sipped our coffee with cornbread and beans, she finally spoke. "Son, we need help. This isn't something we can face alone." I knew exactly who she was talking about, old Martha, the most respected healer in town. Many believed she had the gift of warding off evil energies and undoing works of magic. Although my mother was a woman of faith, devoted to God, she also recognized the power of these beliefs. In places like Pine Hollow, stories about curses and witchcraft were as common as Sunday services. That same afternoon, my mother and I walked to old Martha's house. It was a modest structure on the edge of town, surrounded by large trees and herbs planted in old tin cans. We were greeted by her daughter, a welcoming young woman who invited us in. The air was permeated with the aroma of herbal incense, and on the table were lit candles next to images of Catholic saints. Old Martha received us with a warm smile, but her eyes seemed to capture more than words could express. After serving us coffee and sweet bread, she asked us to relate everything that had happened. My mother recounted every detail, from the symbols at the door to the food that had spoiled inexplicably. Martha listened attentively, making small nods as my mother spoke. When the story was finished, she sighed deeply and said, "This is no coincidence. Someone wishes for your failure, Sarah. But be at ease, we can face this together." She asked me to wait outside while she worked with my mother. Reluctantly, I obeyed and sat on a bench near the entrance. From where I was, I could hear murmurs interspersed with prayers and chants. After what seemed like an eternity, my mother emerged with a small amulet around her neck and a lighter expression on her face. "Old Martha says things will get better, but we need to be patient. Soon we'll know who's behind this," she explained as we walked home. In the following weeks, calm seemed to have returned. I got a job as a construction helper in a neighboring town, which helped with expenses while the store remained closed. My mother took care of the house and my siblings, but couldn't avoid casting suspicious glances at some neighbors. Then one day, something happened that changed everything. One of our neighbors, Mrs. Cooper, who lived right across from our house, decided to open her own store. It was surprising because Cooper had never shown interest in commerce. Moreover, she had been one of our most frequent customers before we closed. To our surprise, her business grew rapidly. The same customers who used to buy from us now went there, and her store prospered in an almost inexplicable way. It didn't take long for my mother to suspect. "It was her," she affirmed one night during dinner. "I'm almost certain it was Mrs. Cooper who caused all this." Although she had no concrete evidence, everything seemed to point in that direction. Still, my mother, remembering old Martha's advice, preferred not to confront her directly. She decided to wait, trusting that the truth would come to light at the right time. A month later, something terrible happened in town. 2 people fell seriously ill after consuming meat bought at Cooper's store. One survived, but the other wasn't so fortunate. The news spread quickly, and her store was abandoned. No one wanted to buy anything there anymore. Rumors about bad luck began to circulate, and the place became empty. To my mother, this seemed like a kind of divine justice. However, she didn't celebrate Cooper's misfortune. Instead, she saw it as a sign that it was time to reopen our store and start over. With that in mind, my mother decided the time had come to resume business. On a Saturday morning, she asked me to accompany her to the city to speak with Mr. Johnson, the supplier who had always stocked us before the closure. I shared her excitement, but also felt an uneasiness. What if the same problems returned? What if there was more sabotage? The journey to the city was long. We took an old bus that took almost 2 hours to drop us off at the market. As we got off, we were greeted by an environment full of energy, the smell of fresh fruits, the sound of vendors offering their products, and people coming and going with full bags. My mother found Mr. Johnson, who seemed pleased to see us back. "Mrs. Callahan, it's good to have you back. Your store was always an example in the town. You can count on me for whatever you need," he said as he helped us organize the initial order. We left the market renewed. That same afternoon, we returned to Pine Hollow with the truck loaded with merchandise. It was a significant investment, almost all the savings we had. But this time, my mother decided to act cautiously, starting small without risking too much. On Monday morning, we got to work. We cleaned the shelves, organized the products, and decorated the entrance of the store with fresh flowers. My siblings participated enthusiastically, excited to see the place full of movement again. Shortly after, we opened the doors. At first, customers came with a certain hesitation, as if they wanted to make sure everything was in order. But gradually, they began to trust us again. Within weeks, the movement started to improve. Workers began to buy lunch at the store. Housewives returned for supplies, and even children appeared to buy sweets once more. My mother was radiant. Although the volume of sales wasn't yet what it used to be, the small business was beginning to regain its vitality. Even though Mrs. Cooper had left town with her family after losing her store, my mother remained vigilant, concerned about the possibility of new witchcraft attacks. The amulet that old Martha had given her never left her neck, and every night she prayed that nothing bad would return to affect us. Feeling the need to reinforce our protection and also to thank her for her help, we decided to visit old Martha again. The healer received us with her usual hospitality, but was more serious than usual, as if she sensed something important. "Sarah, I'm glad your family is well and that everything is improving," she said, holding my mother's hands. "But remember, envy is like a disease, always looking for ways to return." She performed another spiritual cleansing on us using herbs, eggs, and prayers, and gave my mother a second amulet, smaller but equally powerful, according to her words. Before we left, she looked at us deeply and said, "Never forget, the strength of a united family is the greatest protection you have. As long as you remain together and care for one another, nothing can harm you." Over time, the store returned to prosperity. Customers frequented regularly, products arrived without delays, and profits increased. We managed to save enough to buy a new refrigerator and even expand our inventory. This time, my mother acted more cautiously, keeping control of everything and avoiding excessive trust in others. The nights were moments of reflection and gratitude. We dined in the kitchen, recalling difficult times and thanking God for recent victories. The fear of new misfortunes never completely abandoned us, but as my mother used to say, God squeezes but doesn't choke. This faith kept us firm. As the months passed, our routine stabilized. The store wasn't just prospering, it had also become a meeting point for the town's residents. My mother was more at peace, and my siblings and I finally lived less tumultuous days. However, the shadow of suspicion remained. Was someone still harboring envy towards us? One afternoon, as we were closing the store, Mr. Reynolds, a neighbor known for always being well informed about everything happening in Pine Hollow, approached to talk with my mother. He was always kind, but that day his expression carried concern. "Mrs. Callahan, I've been thinking about what happened to you and your store," he began. "Remember when everything started going downhill? It doesn't seem like a coincidence to me. Here in the countryside, we see and hear strange things." Curious but cautious, my mother listened attentively. Mr. Reynolds recounted that shortly before our store began facing problems, he saw Mrs. Cooper leaving in the early morning with a mysterious package. According to him, she had gone to the thicket behind the church, a place avoided by everyone due to stories of witchcraft practices. "I don't want to interfere, but Sarah, those things aren't normal. Take care of yourself and your children," he said seriously. Mr. Reynolds's words seemed to confirm what we already suspected, but my mother remained calm. She thanked him for his concern and said goodbye with a smile. However, that night during dinner, she told us what she had heard, making it clear that although she tried to convey tranquility, apprehension still accompanied her. "These things are dangerous," said my mother, holding the amulet around her neck. "But we won't let fear dominate us. We've faced this before and will face it as many times as necessary." A few days later, something strange happened. It was early morning, and my mother and I were organizing the new products that had arrived. A loud noise from outside caught our attention. When we went out, we saw that one of the boxes left by the door had been destroyed, as if someone had thrown it to the ground. At first, we thought it might have been an accident, but as we approached, we noticed something disturbing. Over the remains of the box were dark ashes arranged in a strange symbol that none of us recognized. My mother, although visibly shaken, remained calm. She asked me to bring water and bleach while she murmured a prayer. I tried to reassure her, suggesting that perhaps it was just a coincidence, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something about the symbol that exuded malice. Later that day, we decided to visit old Martha again. When we reported what had happened, she became serious. "This is not something simple, Sarah," she said as she lit an herbal smudge stick. "Someone is still trying to harm you, but don't worry, we'll strengthen your protection." The ritual this time was more elaborate. Old Martha used herbs, candles, and even asked for a bit of soil from the store. As she did her work, she explained that we shouldn't fear but stay alert. Envy not only destroys its target, but also the one who harbors it. This person will end up destroying themselves alone. It's just a matter of time. Her words echoed in my mind for days. Although we trusted in the protection, concern for my family remained. My mother, on the other hand, seemed more peaceful. She always repeated that as long as we remained united, no one could defeat us. We moved forward. The store prospered, and customers continued to frequent it. But something in the town's air had changed. People were more closed off, as if there were secrets being kept. Rumors about Mrs. Cooper and her possible connection to witchcraft still circulated, but no one dared to speak openly. Then something brought more doubts. One afternoon, as I walked through the city market, I overheard two ladies whispering. One of them mentioned having seen Mrs. Cooper arguing with an unknown man, someone who clearly wasn't from Pine Hollow. They said he had given her something before leaving. Those words left me uneasy. Could it be possible that she had sought help from outside to perform those works? That night, when I told my mother what I had heard, she sighed deeply and looked at me with a mixture of weariness and firmness. "Son, it doesn't matter what they say. We move forward. We won't let fear dominate us." Her words gave me comfort. We knew danger still lurked, but our unity was our greatest weapon. As the days passed, our routine seemed to normalize. Despite this, my mother and I were aware that the situation was still far from resolved. Even with Cooper living far away, rumors about what she had done remained alive, and in Pine Hollow, a feeling of weight remained in the air, as if an invisible shadow had never left. One night, as we dined in the kitchen, an unusual noise came from outside. My mother, apprehensive, asked me to check. I went out and looked around, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. When I returned, she seemed more tense than usual. "Son, something is wrong," she said, adjusting the amulet around her neck. "We need to be alert." A few days later, our tranquility was broken again. It was dawn, and the sound of something hitting the walls of the store woke us up. We rushed to check and were faced with a disturbing scene. On the exterior wall were black marks, as if strange symbols had been burned with fire. The smell of ashes still permeated the air, and small piles of dried herbs were scattered around. Despite the fear, My mother remained calm. She asked me to collect the herbs and burn them far from home, while she scrubbed the marks off the wall with determination. When we finished, we sat in the kitchen immersed in silence, trying to understand what it meant. We knew it wasn't just vandalism, it was a warning. The next morning, we decided to seek old Martha again. When we told her what had happened, her face closed up. "This is no coincidence," she said, lighting more herbal incense. "Whoever is doing this remains determined to harm you, but remember, every act of malice has its price, and this person will pay for it." Old Martha reinforced our protections and gave us new instructions. She told us to keep a candle lit every night in the store, place rue branches in the corners, and recite a rosary before sleeping. Although we were still concerned, her words gave us a sense of security. A few days later, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Wilson, an old neighbor from town, came to visit us. She had always been kind, but seemed restless that afternoon. After some time of conversation, she finally revealed the reason for her visit. "Mrs. Callahan, I know this might not be my business, but I think you need to know," she began, avoiding our gaze. "A while before your store closed, I saw something that left me uncomfortable." She recounted that one night she saw Mrs. Cooper talking to a strange woman near the thicket. The woman was dressed all in black and wore a large hat that hid almost her entire face. Although Mrs. Wilson couldn't hear what they were saying, she had the impression that there was an exchange of something. After that night, things started going badly for us and well for Cooper. I don't know exactly what it was, but I thought I should warn you. My mother listened attentively and thanked her. Although we already suspected, having confirmation brought a strange mixture of validation and concern. Despite the challenges, we persevered. Our store continued to flourish as the weeks passed. Sales increased, and my mother regained her confidence. Although we still vividly remembered the witchcraft attacks, we felt stronger now. My mother continued to wear old Martha's amulet, and every day we followed her guidance. Even though some neighbors still whispered about what had happened, we preferred to focus on our work and our family unity. One afternoon, as my mother and I closed the store, she said something that never left my mind. "Son, we've been through so many things, but each one has made us stronger. No matter how many times they try to knock us down, we'll always get back up." With the return of prosperity, our life became lighter. The days were full of movement, customers coming and going, my siblings laughing as they helped organize the products. Still, something persisted in the air. There were nights when the silence seemed too heavy, and although optimistic, my mother cast uneasy glances out the window, as if waiting for something. One day, at the end of the workday, Mr. Thompson, an old customer, gave us an unexpected warning. "Mrs. Callahan, they're saying strange things about your store. Some say you're also using witchcraft to succeed." The news caught us by surprise. We tried to disguise it, but the discomfort was stamped on our faces. How was it possible that now the rumors were against us? "Don't listen to those things, Mr. Thompson. People love to make up stories," my mother replied calmly, but later added, "Still, it's good to be careful. Envy never sleeps." That same week, something even more disturbing happened. One night, while organizing the last boxes, I saw through the window a man standing in front of our door. He was dressed all in black, with a hat covering his face. At first, I thought he was a customer, but when I went out to attend to him, there was no one there anymore. The street was completely deserted. When I told my mother what I had seen, she was visibly worried but said nothing. That night, she left a candle burning at the entrance of the store and spent more time praying than usual. The next day, we went to Old Martha to report what had happened. Upon hearing about the man in black, she became serious and lit an herbal smudge stick. "This man is not an ordinary person," said the healer. "It's a sign that there's still someone wishing to harm you, but don't be shaken. Your faith and unity are your greatest protections." Old Martha advised us to reinforce security, asking us to sprinkle holy water in the store and at home. A few days later, we received a visit from Mrs. Bennett, a neighbor who arrived concerned. "Mrs. Callahan, I need to tell you something," she began. "I heard that someone in town is paying a witch to harm you again." The news shocked us. According to Mrs. Bennett, there were rumors that a woman, whose name she preferred not to reveal, had sought another witch after Mrs. Cooper left Pine Hollow. Although she didn't know more details, it was enough to put my mother on alert. That night, my mother made a firm decision. We can't stay silent. If they're trying to harm us again, we need to act. But we'll do it with intelligence and without losing faith. The next morning, something happened that changed everything. Upon opening the store, we found at the entrance a wax figure pierced with needles. It was evident that it was a heavy work of witchcraft. Seeing that, my mother knew she could no longer ignore it. Without thinking twice, we took the object and went straight to Old Martha. The healer examined the figure carefully before stating, "This is strong work, but nothing we can't undo. Remember, those who act with bad intentions always pay the price." Old Martha performed a powerful ritual to break the curse. She used candles, herbs, and a container with holy water while chanting prayers aloud. She asked us to remain united and not let fear dominate us. Upon returning home, my mother seemed more calm. During dinner that night, she told me something I still hold dear today. "Son, what matters is not how many times they try to hit us, but how we face it. There will always be people wanting to bring us down, but as long as we're together, no one can destroy us." These words echoed in my mind for days. We knew there was someone trying to harm us, but we also knew not to give in. That small general store was the foundation of our family, the fruit of years of hard work, and we wouldn't let anyone take that away from us again. The same week, another strange thing happened. One night, as we closed the store, we heard a noise coming from the roof. We thought it was just animals, but when we checked, we found strange symbols carved into the wood of the outer walls. We had no idea what they meant, but the sight of them disturbed us. Despite this, my mother maintained her firm posture. "We won't be intimidated," she declared, taking a bucket with holy water and a brush. "We'll clean this up and move forward as always." We spent much of the night scrubbing the marks while she prayed. We worked together to remove them. The fear was there, but our faith was even greater. When we finished, we hung a mirror at the entrance as Old Martha had suggested and left a candle, burning next to a cross that my mother had already placed on the wall. The next day, we went again to Old Martha to report what had happened. She listened with attention, maintaining an expression of concern mixed with determination. "What you're facing is not simple," said the healer. "But remember, evil always destroys itself. Whoever is doing this against you will be revealed." Old Martha performed another protection ritual, this time using fire, herbs, and a wax figure representing our family. She invoked saints and forces of nature, asking for protection against all evil. Before we left, she gave us a special candle and instructed, "Light this candle every night for 7 days. This will strengthen your protection. And never lower your guard." The week passed without new incidents, but the climate in Pine Hollow remained strange. Rumors about those responsible for the attacks against us grew, and more people began to speak openly. It was then that something unexpected happened. A neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who was very close to Mrs. Cooper, suffered an accident at home. Stories said she was meddling with witchcraft, but something went wrong, and she ended up severely burning her hands. The news spread quickly, and many began to connect the dots. Although no one spoke directly, everyone knew that Mrs. Henderson was involved in the attacks against our family. After the incident, some of her relatives stopped visiting her, fearing that the bad luck would spread. When my mother learned of the incident, she merely said, "Evil never goes unpunished." Over time, things finally began to stabilize. Our store prospered again, and the relationship with neighbors significantly improved. Even those who previously avoided us began to frequent our establishment. My mother believed this was a sign that we had overcome the worst moments. Despite this, we never completely relaxed. We continued with our lit candles, family prayers, and rue branches scattered throughout the house. Her amulet remained firmly around her neck. One night during dinner, my mother said something I never forgot. "Son, what matters is not how many times they try to knock you down, but how many times you manage to get up. This store is our home, and as long as we're united, no one can take that away from us." The months after Mrs. Henderson's fall marked a new beginning for our family. The store wasn't just a livelihood, it became a symbol of our resistance. With the return of customers, Pine Hollow regained its serenity little by little. Still, the memories of the difficulties remained alive. Even more at ease, my mother never lowered her guard. She maintained old Martha's protections and reaffirmed her faith, always saying it was faith that kept us firm. Years later, as an adult, I decided to leave Pine Hollow to seek new paths. My mother, although aware of the pain of distance, fully supported me. I opened my first store in the big city, inspired by everything I had learned from her. Over time, our family prospered. My siblings also followed their own dreams, but the bond between us never faded. Although distant, we never forgot our roots in the town. My mother took care of the store in Pine Hollow until her health and advanced age forced her to stop. Still, she continued to be the anchor of the family. Her lessons and her strength to face adversities guided us throughout life. Many years later, we learned that Mrs. Henderson's life had crumbled. Attempts at success in new businesses failed, and she ended up leaving the town isolated and rejected by those who once supported her. Upon hearing the news, my mother commented with serenity, "Light always finds its way. You don't build happiness on the pain of others." But she never showed hatred for Henderson or Cooper. She always said that holding grudges was like poisoning your own soul, and that it was wiser to focus on the good things. When my mother passed away, I felt as if the world had stopped. She was the force that united us and the fighter who built our future. On her deathbed, she held my hand and said, "Son, never forget, the most important thing is family. Everything I did was for you. Move forward with faith and love." These words echo in me to this day. After her departure, our family bonds became even stronger. My siblings and I made a point of gathering whenever possible, recalling the lessons and heritage of our mother, ensuring that her legacy remained alive in each of us. Back in 2005, I decided to start collecting paranormal stories. While my little collection never gained the recognition I'd hoped for, it became a cherished hobby of mine. Since childhood, I've been fascinated by supernatural phenomena. After sharing tales from my family and close friends, I decided to broaden my horizons and seek out stories from others. My grandmother suggested we visit the rural village where her father was born, a tiny place called Raven's Hollow in northern Maine. She mentioned that unusual occurrences were commonplace there, and locals frequently spoke of encounters with the otherworldly. Truthfully, that place harbors incredible stories that perhaps I'll share another time. We left around 10 in the morning, driving through winding country roads toward the village. Upon arrival, we sought out Mrs. Sullivan, who welcomed my grandmother with immense joy, as they hadn't seen each other in decades. We were received with warm hospitality, and after several hours of pleasant conversation, I decided to ask her directly, "Have you ever experienced anything paranormal here in the village?" I explained my interest, and she immediately nodded without hesitation. She began recounting several incidents, but one story in particular left me deeply unsettled. I'll share it with you exactly as she told it to me. Child, many years ago, back in the 1970s, we had barely any streetlights in Raven's Hollow. We would rise before dawn to make the most of daylight hours. One morning around 4:30, I woke up to walk to the old mill. The cold was bitter and penetrating, so I bundled myself in a heavy sweater, a thick wool scarf, and fleece-lined boots. I gathered my sacks of corn and set out. The mill was operated by a man named Frederick Winters in those days. Outside his house stood a single lantern that barely cast enough light to see by. As I approached the entrance, I noticed a woman standing there. She was unusually tall and thin, with long silver hair that completely covered her face. What struck me most was that despite the freezing temperature, she wore only a simple green dress with small white stars and thin leather sandals. In those days, everyone in the village knew each other, but I had never seen this woman before. I walked past her and said, "Good morning," but she remained silent. I found it odd, but continued on my way. I ground my corn, chatted with Mr. Winters and some other early risers, then headed back home. Several hours later, the village was in turmoil. Frederick Winters had been found dead by his grandson. He had collapsed inside his home, apparently from a sudden heart attack. It was shocking because he was someone we'd known for many years, and I had spoken with him just hours before. 3 days later, I left early again and saw the same woman. this time standing at the doorway of the Mackenzie house. By noon, we learned that old Mrs. Mackenzie had passed peacefully in her sleep. This pattern repeated once more with the Cooper family across the road. The mysterious woman appeared at dawn, and by midday, someone in that house had departed this world. I spoke with the families of those who had passed, and we all came to the same conclusion. This figure could only be Death herself, making her rounds through our village. I never saw her again after that winter, though I've witnessed other spirits and unexplained phenomena over the years. But that tall, silent harbinger never returned. The strangest part came years later, when I was looking through some old photographs from the village's founding in the 1800s. In the background of one faded image stood a figure, tall and thin with long silver hair, wearing what appeared to be a simple dress with a pattern of small stars. She was standing outside the home of the village's founder, who, according to the records, died the very day after that photograph was taken. Mrs. Sullivan's voice had grown quiet by the end of her story. The kitchen where we sat suddenly felt much colder than before, and I found myself glancing out the windows at the early evening shadows stretching across the village. "Do you think she's still out there?" I asked. Mrs. Sullivan looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "Death is always out there, dear. Sometimes she just chooses to make herself known before she claims what's hers." I stayed in Raven's Hollow for 3 more days, collecting other stories from the villagers. But none affected me as deeply as the tale of the silent woman in the starry dress, who appeared as a herald of the inevitable. I want to share something that happened to my friend Sarah many years ago. She rarely talks about it, but after a few glasses of mulled wine at our annual holiday gathering last week, she finally opened up about the experience that changed how she views Christmas Eve forever. It was Christmas Eve of 2007. Sarah was 16 then, living in a small New England town where Victorian houses lined streets that became picture-perfect postcards when covered in snow. Unlike most teenagers who couldn't wait to socialize, Sarah preferred her own company, especially during the holidays when forced cheerfulness made her uncomfortable. That particular Christmas Eve, her parents and older brother had been invited to the annual celebration at the historic Blackwood Manor across town. Sarah begged to stay home, claiming she had a headache. Reluctantly, they agreed, leaving her with strict instructions to keep the doors locked and to call if she needed anything. As soon as their car disappeared down the snowy driveway, Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. The house was finally quiet, with only the occasional crackle from the fireplace breaking the silence. She curled up on the vintage leather couch in the living room with her golden retriever, Pixel, snuggled at her feet. The dog was mostly hidden under a thick wool blanket, with only her nose poking out for air. Sarah had been saving the latest psychological thriller movie for this moment of solitude. Behind her, their Christmas tree stood majestically in the corner, adorned with antique ornaments passed down through generations. Beside it was an old German nativity scene her grandmother had brought from the Black Forest region decades ago. Sarah always found it slightly unsettling how the infant Jesus figurine was disproportionately large compared to the other characters, almost as if it were watching over everything with its painted eyes. The snow was falling heavily outside, creating a hypnotic white noise against the windows. Sarah was halfway through her movie when she heard an odd scraping sound coming from the roof. She paused the film and listened intently. Scrape, thump, scrape. She chuckled nervously to herself. Santa Claus making an early delivery, she whispered. Rationally, she assumed it was just snow sliding off the steep Victorian roof, or perhaps branches from the old oak tree scratching against the shingles. She resumed her movie, trying to recapture the suspense. But then she heard something else, a delicate tinkling sound coming from the direction of the Christmas tree. The ornaments were swaying slightly, as if someone had just walked past them. Pixel, who had been peacefully sleeping, suddenly raised her head and let out a low, warning growl. Her eyes were fixed on the tree, pupils dilated. "It's nothing, girl," Sarah said, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her rising unease. She paused the movie again and approached the tree cautiously. The ornaments continued to sway even, though there was no draft in the room. The heating system wasn't running. The windows were sealed against the winter cold. There was no logical explanation for the movement. Sarah's heart began to race. She searched the entire downstairs, checking behind furniture and in closets. She even looked out the windows to see if someone might be playing a prank. But the freshly fallen snow outside was unmarked by footprints. The doors remained locked from the inside. The scraping sounds returned, louder this time, accompanied by what sounded like rhythmic tapping. It was as if someone or something was dancing on her roof. To reassure herself, Sarah turned on every light in the house, including the exterior Christmas lights that illuminated the yard, with a cheerful multicolored glow that felt strangely at odds with her growing terror. It was nearly midnight when exhaustion began to overcome her fear. Her eyelids grew heavy as she fought to stay awake, not wanting to be vulnerable to whatever was causing the disturbances. Just as she was drifting off, she felt a sharp, painful tug on her hair, not gentle, but forceful enough to snap her head backward. She cried out in pain and grabbed at her scalp, feeling several strands come loose in her hand. It wasn't her imagination. Someone had pulled her hair with enough force to tear some out. "Pixel," she called out, her voice shaking. "Pixel, come here, girl." There was no response. Panicking, Sarah searched the house, finally finding her dog wedged into the narrow space between her bed and the wall. Pixel was shivering uncontrollably, her eyes wide with fear. No amount of coaxing would make her come out. Then, drifting from the living room below, Sarah heard something that made her blood run cold, a child's voice, high-pitched and playful. "Are you scared now?" Sarah froze on the stairs, convinced she was hallucinating. Summoning courage she didn't know she possessed, she crept back down to the living room, clutching her cell phone, though she knew there was no signal due to the snowstorm. The living room appeared normal at first glance. The tree lights blinked in their programmed pattern, casting colorful shadows across the walls. But as she approached, she noticed the ornaments were now swinging violently, as if caught in a strong breeze. Her gaze was drawn to the nativity scene. The figurines were arranged as always, except for one detail. The infant Jesus was missing from its cradle. In its place, perched on the edge of the manger, was something else, a tiny figure, no larger than her hand, with a deeply wrinkled face that resembled ancient leather. It was humanoid, but decidedly not human, with elongated fingers and pointed ears that poked through wisps of white hair. It wore what looked like clothes made from dried leaves and bark. Most disturbing were its eyes, jet black and glistening in the Christmas lights like polished obsidian. The creature tilted its head and spoke in that same childlike voice, looking at me. "Aren't you afraid?" Sarah screamed and stumbled backward, knocking over a side table. She ran upstairs to her bedroom and locked the door, diving under the covers alongside Pixel, who was still trembling. Minutes later, she heard knocking at the front door. Terrified it might be the creature somehow grown to human size, she remained silent until she heard a familiar voice calling her name. It was Mrs. Fletcher, their 70-year-old neighbor, who lived alone in the Victorian house next door. Reluctantly, Sarah went downstairs. "I saw all your lights on and thought I'd check if everything was all right," Mrs. Fletcher said, her kind face creased with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost, dear." Between sobs, Sarah recounted everything that had happened. To her surprise, Mrs. Fletcher didn't dismiss her story. Instead, the older woman's expression grew serious as she stepped inside and methodically examined the house. "I'll make us some tea, Mrs. Fletcher said finally, guiding Sarah to the kitchen. As they sat at the table, the scraping sounds on the roof started again, this time accompanied by what sounded like small bells. Mrs. Fletcher's eyes widened. "Stay here," she instructed firmly. Through the kitchen window, Sarah watched in astonishment as the elderly woman stood in the snow-covered yard, her face turned upward toward the roof. She was speaking words Sarah couldn't understand, not English, but something that sounded ancient and powerful. Mrs. Fletcher's hands moved in intricate patterns as she continued her strange incantation. Gradually, the sounds from the roof faded away. When her family returned home around 1 a.m, finding Mrs. Fletcher there, they assumed Sarah had gotten scared by the storm and called for company. Pixel emerged from under the bed as if nothing unusual had happened, happily greeting everyone with her wagging tail. Most of the family attributed Sarah's wild story to an overactive imagination, combined with watching a scary movie alone during a snowstorm. All except her father. Later, when they were alone, he said quietly, "I believe you, Sarah. When we were walking to the car at Blackwood Manor, I heard something moving in the garden. I saw something skittering behind the hedges. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to frighten your mother. I never thought it would follow us home." Those words brought Sarah both comfort and deeper dread. She wasn't losing her mind, but that meant what she'd seen was real. In the days that followed, Mrs. Fletcher taught Sarah about household protections and the strange beings that sometimes cross into our world during the winter solstice, when the veil between worlds is thinnest. They're tricksters mostly, she explained, but they can be dangerous if they take a particular interest in you. Sarah never stayed home alone on Christmas Eve again. Her family now makes it a tradition to bring Pixel everywhere they go during the holidays. Neither she nor her father ever saw the creature again, though sometimes, when hanging ornaments on the tree, Sarah swears she can feel tiny eyes watching her from somewhere in the shadows. So if you're planning to spend this Christmas Eve alone, perhaps reconsider your plans. And if you must stay alone, keep your dog close. your lights on, and maybe give your nativity scene a careful look before you go to sleep. I want to share a story about the place where I live. The house I call home was built in 1893 by my great-grandfather. Interestingly, it wasn't originally constructed as a residence, but as an old flour mill. They produced artisanal flour and cornmeal there. The house sits right beside a creek and has 2 natural springs beneath it. We still maintain and clean one of them regularly, while the other was permanently buried during recent floods. The land that belonged to my great-grandfather was immense, spanning somewhere between 30 and 40 acres. Over time, the story of how the property left our family became unclear. What we do know is that a large factory was built on part of the land, starting as a textile mill called Oakwood Textiles. During its golden years, this factory specialized in knitwear and produced an enormous quantity of sweaters and winter clothing. However, over the years, the workers filed lawsuits due to unpaid wages, and the place was eventually shut down. Since then, it has been completely abandoned. My house sits directly behind this factory. To reach it, you must walk through a narrow alley, about 150 feet long. Although it's not particularly far, there's something about this path that makes it seem endless, whether day or night. My great-grandmother, who was like a mother to my mother, lived many years in this converted mill. When I was 5, we moved in with her. My mother, being a homemaker, wanted to care for her since she was elderly and living alone. My father, who's been working as a trucker for 25 years, was always on the road, so it was mostly just my mother and me most of the time. A curious memory remains etched in my mind. One early morning, my father was returning from a long haul. The alley leading to our house is wide enough for a small car, but cannot accommodate large trucks. At the end of this alley, there's a pedestrian bridge crossing the creek. Upon arrival, my father called my mother, asking her to open the gate, but she took a while to come out. While waiting near the gate, he heard the sound of a woman crying inside the abandoned factory. He wasn't afraid. In fact, he was concerned, thinking the security guards might have accidentally locked someone inside. He even spoke to reassure her, saying he would call my mother to help. When my mother finally opened the gate, my father told her what had happened. She found it strange and assured him that no one worked there anymore, as all the machinery had been removed long ago. Even so, he tried calling out again, but with no response, he eventually gave up. Later, when he recounted the episode to my uncle, who also lived on the property, he was called crazy and ridiculed. However, years later, this same uncle experienced something very similar. One early morning, while parking his car, he heard a woman crying inside the factory. Remembering my father's story, he didn't have the courage to investigate. He ran into his house and swore never to mock others' experiences again. We left my great-grandmother's old house because she could no longer climb stairs. Nevertheless, we returned about 2 years ago to care for her. Now, at 87, she depends on us for almost everything. Last September, in the neighboring town of Preston, the traditional harvest festival was taking place. That day, I went with my boyfriend, and although we didn't stay very late, it was already past 9 when I returned home. I remember walking alone through the alley. Despite the stories told by my father and uncle, I wasn't afraid. However, I had forgotten my keys. While trying to get a signal on my cell phone to ask my mother to open the door, I heard something. Yes, I heard it. A woman crying. The lamentations were long, interspersed with deep sighs. I felt a shiver down my spine and ran, quickly descending the stairs of the bridge, without knowing exactly why. I grabbed a stone and threw it at the tin roof to get my mother's attention. When I finally saw her, I climbed back up the stairs, afraid of hearing that sound again. Fortunately, I didn't hear anything more. Perhaps whatever was there had gone away, or simply fallen silent. This episode happened shortly after we moved back. Days later, something strange happened again. I was in the living room doing college assignments, while my mother was in her bedroom. I thought she was already asleep. However, I began to hear someone rummaging through the dresser drawers. I assumed it was my mother until she shouted, "Rebecca, what are you looking for in the drawer?" I replied, "Mom, I'm still here in the living room. I thought it was you." We both pretended not to be scared, trying to ignore what had happened. I turned off the computer, switched off the lights, and went to bed. The next day, we talked and realized we had both heard exactly the same thing without any logical explanation. The house, as I mentioned, was once a flour mill. And because of this, the division of rooms is not very conventional. The main bedroom, for example, has 3 spaces. The beds are at the front, the living room and dining table in the center, and the kitchen at the back. There's a window in the bedroom, and 2 others in the living room. When I was a child, I remember one night when I got up out of curiosity to peek through the window. From there, you can clearly see the creek, and it was there that I saw something I'll never forget. A woman dressed in white floating above the water. At that moment, I didn't hear any sound, and being very young, I had no idea what it could be. Even so, I was terrified. I ran to my mother's bed, curled up beside her, and couldn't wake her because she sleeps deeply. I woke up wet with urine, which was unusual for me. After this episode, I began wetting the bed frequently. As time passed, I grew accustomed to the strange occurrences in the house, although I still try to find rational explanations for everything. Most times, they simply don't appear. For instance, once my great-grandmother was at my uncle's house on the same property. She had undergone surgery and couldn't walk. Even so, I swear I saw her standing in front of a window. I rushed to check if something had happened, but upon entering the house, I couldn't find her. I went to her room, and there she was, sleeping soundly. I searched the rest of the house and the bathroom to see if there was anyone else, but there wasn't. At that moment, it was just the 2 of us in that space. During the pandemic lockdown, my sleep schedule became completely irregular. Twice I stayed up all night and heard the same crying that previously seemed to come from the factory, but now came from the creek. The first time I imagined it was my mother or one of my siblings crying, but they were all asleep. The second time, while watching a series, I simply turned up the volume to ignore it. I no longer feel so afraid of these lamentations. However, a few months ago, I experienced something much more disturbing. I was sleeping when I felt a terrible pressure on my chest. It seemed like sleep paralysis, but I knew it was more than that. I could clearly see a cat on my chest. When I tried to move to remove it, I distinctly heard the sound of paws jumping to the floor. I became irritated, thinking my mother's little dog was to blame. I went to her to complain, but to my surprise, my mother said the dog had spent the night outside. 2 days later, late at night, I was listening to music and almost dozing off when a terrifying scream woke me up. It was so loud and frightening that I can't describe it. At first, I thought it was part of a dream or some strange interference in the sound. But then I heard the scream 2 more times while perfectly awake. It was something scary, impossible to ignore. The strangest thing was that no one else in the house heard anything. Not even the dog reacted. On the contrary, he was sleeping deeply, as was the entire family. I tried to calm myself, but something even more disturbing happened. I felt the empty side of the bed sink as if someone had sat there. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but then I heard a sound nearby, like nails scratching my pillow. I don't know how I found the courage, but I jumped out of bed and went to sleep in the living room where my parents were spending the night. My father, recovering from a recent heart attack, had been using the living room as a bedroom. I tried to wake them, but they were sleeping so deeply that nothing seemed capable of rousing them. I collapsed on the couch next to them and cried until I fell asleep. The next morning, I told them what had happened. My father, always calm, said, "Don't be frightened, Rebecca. You heard it, but it can't harm you." I explained the details of the scream, and he imitated it perfectly. "Yes, it's the lady in white. If I didn't wake up, it's because something strange happens when she passes by here. Only those who are awake hear her. The others fall into such a deep sleep that nothing wakes them. I don't know what really exists on my great-grandfather's old property, but I'm certain it's not something ordinary. Maybe it's the lady in white. Maybe it's something else that cries and floats above the creek. I can't explain it, but there's something very strange here. As I finish writing this story, I can see through the window the same place where all this happens, and I wonder if tonight I'll hear her cries again." Some stories transport us directly into someone else's life, as if we could feel their joys, challenges, and uncertainties along the way. This is a story that made me reflect on the power of human relationships and family bonds that can be as complicated as they are profound. My name is Emma. I grew up in rural Vermont, where I spent most of my childhood and early adult years, surrounded by sprawling green hills and close-knit communities. During my college years at the University of Vermont, I crossed paths with Nathan, a hardworking and dedicated young man who had grown up in a small town in Maine, but had spent most of his life moving between different cities along the East Coast for his education. Nathan had a captivating gentleness about him that enchanted me from the beginning. It didn't take long for our relationship to evolve, and a little over a year later, we decided to get married. The ceremony was modest, as Nathan's family couldn't afford to travel and organize something more elaborate. Despite the limitations, we were radiant and full of plans for the future. For our honeymoon, we chose a journey by car, visiting various towns along the New England coastline before arriving at the coastal village in Maine where Nathan's family lived. There I would have the opportunity to meet his parents, and for a while, we would make this place our home while he completed his studies. Our arrival was marked by Nathan's excitement to introduce me to his parents. As soon as we pulled up in front of the weathered wooden house, the two came out to meet us. I extended my hand to greet his mother, Mrs. Alina Morrison, but she completely ignored me, preferring instead to embrace Nathan enthusiastically. His father, on the other hand, was welcoming, shaking my hand firmly and expressing his joy in meeting me. Alina's initial indifference bothered me, but I tried to dismiss it, thinking it might just be a misunderstanding. However, as time passed, it became clear that her attitude was intentional. She was a woman with a stern appearance, of medium height, with eyes that seemed to penetrate anyone who crossed her gaze. Her rigid posture made me uncomfortable from the start. When I met Nathan's brothers and their wives, I felt a bit more welcome, although they maintained a certain reserve. His younger sisters, still teenagers, barely interacted with me. By the end of that afternoon, while alone in the bathroom, I began to question whether I had acted hastily in marrying without getting to know his family better. Since we didn't have our own home, they offered us a simple room at the back of the house. The space, built with wooden planks and covered by a metal roof, was small but met our temporary needs. As I organized our things, I noticed that Nathan was excitedly talking with his father about the future, while I tried to adapt to the new routine. Soon, small gestures of rejection from Alina began to appear. During dinner, for example, she served me a much smaller portion than the others, justifying that she had forgotten to count me when preparing the food. I tried to ignore these episodes, but their frequency only increased. While Nathan looked for work, I decided to occupy my time productively. I remembered the skills my mother had taught me and began knitting scarves and hats with materials purchased at a local craft store. I planned to sell them in a nearby shop to supplement our income. I spent many hours in that stuffy room that became my refuge against the stares and words of my mother-in-law. One day, after finishing several pieces, I carefully laid them on the bed and went to take a shower. When I returned, all were torn, as if someone had done it deliberately. I questioned Alina about the incident, but she merely shrugged, suggesting the dog could be the culprit. However, the gleam in her eyes told me she knew much more than she was willing to admit. As days passed, my relationship with my mother-in-law became even more complicated. Comments loaded with irony and hostile gestures were constant, but I insisted on maintaining my calm, believing that with time, the situation might improve. However, the atmosphere in the house grew increasingly heavy, as if something invisible was pressing on me, making the environment almost unbearable. It seemed I was under continuous surveillance. Every move of mine was examined, as if Alina was waiting for any slip to reinforce her disapproval. She didn't need to say much. Her looks and small attitudes clearly conveyed what she thought of me. One day, while Nathan was out with his father to resolve work matters, we received an unexpected visit. His godmother, Mrs. Vivian Taylor, tall and thin, had a striking presence. Her deep voice carried a natural authority, and each of her words seemed to echo through the room. As soon as we were introduced, I felt an inexplicable discomfort. Her gaze seemed to undress me, and despite her cordial words, there was a certain coldness and contempt in her tone that was impossible to ignore. While Nathan was away, I remained in the living room with Alina and Vivian. I wanted to escape to the room and focus on my knitting work, but my mother-in-law insisted it would be rude to leave the visitor alone. With no choice, I sat with them. Vivian then began bombarding me with questions about my family, my plans, and even when we were thinking of having children. Although the questions might have seemed harmless, the tone with which they were asked was incisive, almost accusatory. When Nathan returned, he was received with enthusiasm by Vivian, who called him my dear boy, while casually dropping that I looked so thin it seemed I wasn't eating properly. Nathan just smiled, not noticing the provocation, while I retreated to the room, trying to contain my discomfort. By this point, I had finished several knitted pieces and was about to take them to the store to sell. Before leaving, I carefully arranged them on the bed and went to get some water. When I returned, they were completely destroyed, as if they had been cut or deliberately chewed. I asked my mother-in-law what might have happened, and she blamed the house dog, a placid animal that spent most of its time sleeping. However, the gleam in her eye revealed that she knew more than she was saying. Shortly after, Nathan secured a job, bringing much-needed relief to us. With the first paycheck, we began looking for a place where we could have more privacy. We found a modest house near the center of town. Despite its condition, it represented our freedom. The move was like a breath of renewal. Away from the constant criticism of my mother-in-law, I finally felt I could breathe again. With the little we had, I began organizing our new home and returned to dedicating myself to knitting. To my surprise, the pieces began to sell very well. The shop owner where I left them even asked that I produce more to maintain the stock. For a brief moment, I experienced a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. But as I soon discovered, this tranquility wouldn't last long. One afternoon, while I was organizing the kitchen, I heard knocking at the door. It was my mother-in-law, accompanied by Vivian and two of her daughters. They appeared without warning, and as always, Nathan received them with his typical hospitality. I forced myself to be a good hostess, but something in me said that this meeting would bring nothing good. During lunch, I used new plates I had bought with money from the knitted items. They were beautiful and, in a way, symbolized my effort and independence. To my surprise, my mother-in-law and Vivian offered to take the plates to the kitchen after lunch, something they had never done before. Shortly after, a loud noise caught my attention. Upon entering the kitchen, I saw 3 broken plates on the floor. Alina, with an almost provocative smile, commented that they had slipped from her hands. Vivian, in a tone of complicity, confirmed the accident, and both laughed as if it were an inside joke. Despite these episodes, the following months brought new joy. I discovered I was pregnant with my first child. Nathan was radiant, and I also felt happy, although I still carried the emotional weight of everything I had gone through. When the baby was born, my mother-in-law offered to help, but her actions ended up being more harmful than useful. Shortly after the birth, she brought the entire family to our house, and without regard for my recovery state, demanded that I prepare a meal for everyone. This was when Nathan began to notice the pressure his mother exerted on me. For the first time, he asked her to respect our space and let us rest. However, the problems didn't end there. During a visit to her house, she insisted on giving water to the baby. Reluctantly, I agreed. It was then that, as she held the bottle, I noticed she was pressing it with such force that the baby began to choke. Terrified, I ran to take him, trying to help him breathe. Nathan intervened quickly and managed to calm him. My mother-in-law, showing no emotion, merely said she was only trying to help. But what profoundly marked me was the cynical smile she displayed while it all happened. At that moment, I decided I would only return to her house on extremely necessary occasions. After this incident, I maintained my firm position of avoiding frequent visits. Nathan supported me, but sometimes tried to justify his mother's behavior, suggesting it might be a misunderstanding. Still, something in my heart told me there was a darker intention behind her actions and Vivian's complicity. A few months later, new news brought joy to our home. I was pregnant again. Nathan was ecstatic, and although I shared his joy, I couldn't avoid the feeling of concern that hovered over me. I had already learned to be cautious, and the frequent visits of my mother-in-law and Vivian only reinforced my discomfort. They began to appear frequently, bringing food and insisting that I try it, even when I said I had already eaten. To avoid conflicts, I ended up accepting. Over time, I began to notice something strange in my health. First came mild pains that I attributed to pregnancy. However, the symptoms intensified. Unbearable fatigue, body aches, constant nausea, and an inexplicable heavy feeling in my chest. Something inside me said it wasn't just the pregnancy. Nathan took me to the health clinic, but the tests showed nothing abnormal. The specialists assured that both the baby and I were fine. However, my health worsened each day. When my mother learned of the situation, she traveled from Vermont to stay with me. Upon seeing me, she was shocked by my appearance. I had lost so much weight that I barely looked like the same person. Concerned, she decided to stay to take care of me and help with my eldest son, who was only 1 year old. With her support, I managed to get through the following weeks, although my condition remained concerning. It was during this period that a nurse, hired by my mother to administer IV fluids, mentioned something that caught my attention. She said that in that region, it was common to hear cases of people resorting to witchcraft to harm others. At first, I rejected the idea. I had always been skeptical, and thinking that someone could use spiritual works to affect me seemed absurd. But my mother, distressed by my situation, decided to seek help. The nurse mentioned she knew a folk healer, a woman known for dealing with this type of problem. Without hesitation, my mother agreed to call her. The healer arrived on a quiet afternoon. She was an elderly woman with an expression that mixed serenity and authority. As soon as she saw me, she stated with conviction that what I was facing was not something natural. According to her, someone had performed a work to harm me, not just me, but also my marriage, with the intention of driving us away from there. When I asked who could be behind it, she avoided giving names, but made it clear they were close people, driven by envy. The healer performed a spiritual cleansing in our house, and guided me on prayers and baths that I should take in the following days. Additionally, she prepared a tea for Nathan, stating it would help him see things clearly and protect himself. After the ritual, I began to notice a slight improvement. Gradually, my health, previously in accelerated decline, stabilized. I regained my strength and returned to eating normally. However, the most disturbing episode happened when I went out to stroll in the park with my eldest son. I encountered Vivian, who approached with the same smile that had always caused me suspicion. She commented that I seemed to be much better, but quickly added with an ironic tone that my recovery had been a true miracle. Her words left me speechless, but confirmed the suspicions I already had. She was involved. That night, I shared the incident with Nathan. Initially, he tried to dismiss my concerns, but later agreed to listen. I explained that I had sought spiritual help, since doctors found no explanations for my condition. Despite being initially skeptical, he ended up accepting that something strange was happening. From that moment, Nathan began to distance himself from his mother and godmother. He did this carefully, without creating direct conflicts, but avoided any unnecessary proximity. Over time, I noticed changes in Nathan's posture. He no longer blindly defended Alina or Vivian, but also didn't want to confront them openly. His solution was to maintain a safe distance, limiting visits to the essential, and ensuring I didn't need to accompany him. This attitude brought some relief to my life, but I knew the problem wouldn't be solved so easily. There were deeper issues that still hovered over us, like difficult-to-dispel shadows. While organizing the house on a seemingly ordinary day, I received an unexpected visit from Alina. She arrived carrying a bag of food, and in a tone of voice that, although trying to sound friendly, revealed secondary intentions. She said she had prepared the dishes especially for me and the children. I thanked her politely, but something in me screamed not to touch that food. I decided to store everything without tasting it, and following the healer's guidance, buried the food in the backyard. Later that same night, Nathan returned from work with a heavy countenance. He recounted that his mother had made comments insinuating that I was inventing stories to distance him from the family, and that I even spoke ill of his sisters. For the first time in a long time, Nathan didn't blindly accept Alina's words. He stated that he knew this wasn't like me, and although he wanted to believe it was all just a misunderstanding, he recognized there was something wrong with his mother's behavior. Shortly after, strange things began to happen in our house. One morning, upon waking, I saw dark soil marks at the entrance, as if they were human footprints, but they suddenly stopped at the door. I cleaned immediately, but couldn't avoid the feeling of discomfort. That same night, while in the kitchen, I heard heavy footsteps on the roof, as if someone was walking on top. Nathan went out to check, but found nothing. Despite trying to ignore these occurrences, deep down, I knew they were signs of something greater. I decided to call the healer again. As soon as she arrived, she examined the house carefully and found objects hidden in unlikely places. A piece of fabric secured with knots and pins, a small flask containing a dark liquid, and a photo of Nathan and me covered in soil and melted wax. She explained that these items were part of a work to sow discord and separation between us. Together, we destroyed all the objects and performed a new cleansing in the home. After this, my relationship with Nathan gained more strength. He began to trust the healer's warnings more, and showed himself more protective of me and the children. However, Alina and Vivian didn't give up. They continued trying to approach, suddenly appearing at our house, or sending messages through family members. Despite showing apparent concern, I knew there was another intention behind their actions. A particularly disturbing episode occurred during a family gathering. We decided to attend the birthday of one of Nathan's younger sisters. Everything seemed calm, until I noticed that Vivian never took her eyes off me. At one point, she approached and with a smile that still shadows me said, "No matter what you do, we'll always be one step ahead of you." I was paralyzed, speechless. Nathan noticed my discomfort and suggested we leave, justifying that the children were tired. That night, I shared with him what had happened. Despite trying to remain calm, I saw in his face the reflection of his concern. We knew this fight was far from over, but we were determined to protect our family at any cost. After that unsettling family encounter, Nathan and I made the decision to cut all unnecessary ties with his mother and Vivian. For him, it wasn't easy, but we both knew it was essential to protect our family. From then on, we restricted visits to important occasions like birthdays or Christmas, and always with great caution. Still, the distancing didn't prevent the two from continuing to try to exert their influence. A few days later, I began to notice changes again in my health. This time they were different symptoms: persistent headaches, nights without being able to sleep, and a constant feeling of weakness. Nathan also began to feel the effects. He arrived from work exhausted and frequently mentioned an inexplicable irritation. It was clear that something was wrong, but we couldn't find an explanation. One afternoon, while cleaning the house, I came across a strange object under the bed. A small black cloth bag containing what appeared to be soil, hair strands, and nails. Instantly, I remembered the healer's warnings. Without directly touching the object, I wrapped it in paper and took it to her. As soon as she saw it, the healer confirmed what I feared. It was a binding spell, a work done to provoke weakness and cause illness. She explained to us that this type of spell was powerful when the victims didn't take protective measures. She performed another cleansing in our home and gave us amulets to always carry with us. Additionally, she reinforced the importance of not accepting anything coming from Alina or Vivian, be it food, gifts, or visits. We decided to rigorously follow her guidelines, focusing our energies on strengthening our bond as a couple. Shortly after, good news brought relief and renewal to our home. Nathan received a promotion at work, which would allow us to move to a larger house in another neighborhood. The possibility of finally distancing ourselves from the loaded environment of his family gave us hope. We spent the following days packing our things and organizing the move, although a slight concern about possible consequences hovered in the air. On moving day, as we were taking the last boxes to the truck, Alina suddenly appeared, as she always did, bringing a cake with her. Her expression tried to convey sympathy, but the tone of her visit was clear. She stated that she wanted to say goodbye in a friendly manner. I thanked her but politely declined, explaining that everything was packed and we had no time to talk. Her reaction was immediate. The smile disappeared, and she cast me an icy look. Before leaving, she said in a cold and direct tone, "No matter where you go, we'll always know where to find you." That night, already settled in the new house, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. We were finally away from the physical presence of Alina and Vivian, but I knew their intentions wouldn't dissipate so easily. Still, I made the firm decision not to allow their negativity to continue affecting our family. In the following weeks, our routine finally gained some tranquility. Nathan and I dedicated ourselves to organizing the new house and adapting to the environment. It seemed that things were settling down until I received an unexpected phone call. It was Nathan's youngest sister, informing that Alina was gravely ill. She said that her mother wanted to see me, but would understand if I chose not to go. The news left me shaken. Despite everything we had faced, I couldn't ignore the possibility that she was truly suffering. After talking with Nathan, we decided to visit her, but with caution. Upon arrival, we found Alina sitting in a wheelchair, visibly weakened. Her skin was pale, and the once severe gaze seemed lost. For the first time, she said nothing, just looked at me, mixing resentment and fragility. I remained there out of respect, but maintaining the emotional distance that I had fought so hard to build. The experience was profoundly strange, seeing such an intimidating woman now reduced to this state. It awakened mixed feelings in me. On one hand, I felt compassion for her fragility. On the other, I couldn't ignore all the suffering she had caused. Nathan also maintained a reserved posture. We spent little time on the visit, just enough to be cordial, and returned home. A few days later, I received another phone call, this time from a cousin of Nathan's. She asked to meet us at a cafe, as she had something important to tell. Reluctantly, I agreed. During the conversation, she revealed rumors she had heard about Alina and Vivian. According to what she heard, both had used witchcraft practices to try to control their children and keep them close. Furthermore, their actions had focused especially on me, believing I was a bad influence on Nathan. Although the reports weren't exactly a surprise, hearing them from another person left me impacted. I returned home and told everything to Nathan. Initially, he doubted, but soon remembered the objects we had found and all the problems we had faced since our marriage. Gradually, he began to accept that his mother's and godmother's attitudes went beyond simple jealousy or disapproval. It was something much deeper and disturbing. We decided to seek the healer again. With her usual calm, she listened to our story and confirmed that Alina's and Vivian's intentions surpassed the acceptable. She explained that the diseases both were facing weren't coincidences, but the result of their own actions. According to her, the negative energy they had channeled to harm us ended up turning against them, weakening them. Following her recommendations, we performed another spiritual cleansing in the house and reinforced our protections with amulets and prayers. We decided, for the good of our family, to definitively cut any bond with Alina and the people close to her. As time passed, our life began to find stability. Nathan immersed himself in work, while I continued expanding my small craft business. Each day, we felt more lightness in our home, as if the shadows of the past were finally staying behind. Although news occasionally arrived about Alina's health state, I avoided any involvement. Nathan made quick visits, but never took the children. One day, while organizing the house, I found an old box that we had brought from his parents' house during the move. I didn't even remember having stored it. Curious, I opened it. Inside were letters and old photos of Nathan's family. Among the papers, I found a letter written by a woman named Rose, who apparently had been a close friend of Vivian's. In the letter, Rose described a ritual that she and Vivian had performed in the past to keep their families united and under control. According to the account, the ritual seemed to work initially, but over time, they began to notice frightening side effects. Rose mentioned that the energy generated by the ritual brought diseases, losses, and conflicts to their lives. I took the letter to Nathan. He had difficulty processing everything, but finally began to understand that many of the tragedies in his family weren't mere coincidences. We decided to burn the letter and any other object that might be related to those practices, as a symbolic gesture to end that dark cycle of our lives. As we burned the letter and rid ourselves of any physical trace of the practices that had marked us so much, I felt a relief I hadn't experienced in a long time. Still, I knew that the true closure of this chapter would require more than that. The emotional and spiritual scars would need time to heal. Nathan, although more contained, also seemed to carry an invisible weight, something he didn't verbalize, but that was perceptible. With the passing months, our life finally began to stabilize. Our children grew healthy and happy, and our home became a refuge of peace. My craft business flourished, and Nathan continued progressing in his career. Despite everything seeming well, the memories of the difficult years remained like invisible scars, reminding us how fragile the peace we had conquered was. News about Alina became increasingly rare. Sometimes we heard that her health continued deteriorating. Other times, that she had isolated herself from much of the family. One day, Nathan received the news that his mother had passed away. Despite all the conflicts, her death profoundly shook him. We decided to attend the funeral, not out of obligation, but out of respect. The funeral was marked by a heavy atmosphere. Few relatives attended, and Vivian's absence was notable. We learned that she too was gravely ill and couldn't accompany her friend in her final moments. During the ceremony, I noticed looks of curiosity and resentment from some family members directed at me, but I chose to ignore them. My only focus at that moment was to support Nathan in his grief. After the funeral, in a calm conversation, Nathan made a confession he had been keeping for a long time. He had recurring dreams in which his mother and Vivian tried to reclaim him. He described how he always woke up with a feeling of anguish, but said that these dreams ceased right after the last spiritual cleansing in the house. His words made it clear that, although we had found our peace, the traumas of the past still accompanied us, even if in a subtle way. This confession made me reflect on everything we had lived through. Alina's and Vivian's actions not only disturbed our relationship and our peace, but also left deep marks on their own family dynamics. Over time, the bonds they tried so hard to manipulate ended up unraveling, leaving them lonely in their final years of life. We decided from that moment that the past would no longer have power over our present. Our focus became reinforcing the bonds within our family and fully enjoying the life we had managed to build despite all the challenges. As the years passed, our children grew surrounded by love and stability, far from the shadows that once threatened to consume us. Today, revisiting these memories, I don't feel hatred or resentment. What remains is a profound feeling of gratitude for having managed to overcome that difficult period. I learned that true strength lies not in trying to control or subjugate, but in living with love, respect, and faith, the pillars that sustained us in the darkest moments. Although the scars of the past are still present, they are reminders of what we managed to overcome. They show me that even in the face of evil, it's possible to resist with courage and hope. building something new and stronger for the future. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.